There is a river that knows things. It does not speak in any language you were taught in school. It does not leave records in archives or photographs in museums. It does not send letters or make phone calls or post anything anywhere for anyone to find. But it holds things, deep in its mud and silt and cold dark water, and in the land pressed flat along its edges, where the current once ran wide before it narrowed into its present channel. It holds things the way old houses hold the smell of people who lived there before you, the way certain rooms feel heavy with something you cannot name. The Mississippi River holds the oldest unspoken history on this continent, and almost nobody is paying attention. You probably know this river as a geographic fact, something you crossed on a highway bridge without much thought, or traced with your finger on a map in 3rd grade, noting that it divides the country roughly in half and drains into the Gulf of Mexico somewhere below New Orleans. You know it from Mark Twain, maybe, or from the flooding news coverage that seems to come every decade when it spills over its banks and swallows towns that were probably built too close to begin with. You know it as a feature of the landscape, permanent and obvious, something that has always been there. But here is what almost nobody tells you about the Mississippi River. The landscape around it, the floodplains and terraces and bluffs that border it for 1,000 miles in either direction, is one of the most archaeologically significant regions on the entire planet. And much of what lies beneath it, and beneath the fields and parking lots and subdivisions that crowd its banks, has never been properly studied, never been fully excavated, and in many cases has been actively buried, flooded, paved over, or simply ignored by a mainstream historical tradition that spent most of its existence refusing to believe anything interesting happened in North America before Europeans arrived. That refusal is starting to crack, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that old certainties always crack, slowly and then suddenly, as discoveries pile up that refuse to fit the old story, structures that should not exist where they were found, engineering that should not have been possible at the time it was built, trade networks that should not have spanned the distances they apparently spanned, evidence of astronomical knowledge so precise it required generations of careful observation to achieve, evidence of a civilization, or perhaps several civilizations layered on top of each other across thousands of years, that was doing things in the middle of the North American continent that our textbooks have never adequately explained. This is that story. Or rather, this is what we currently know of that story, which is itself only a fragment, only the visible edge of something that stretches much further back in time and much deeper into the ground than anyone has yet been able to confirm. We are going to follow the river. We are going to walk the bluffs and wade into the archaeological record and sit with the strangeness of what has been found there and what keeps being found there, and what the implications might be if we take all of it seriously. We are going to go slowly, because this is the kind of story that deserves to be told slowly, the kind of mystery that loses something when you rush it. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Before we go anywhere near the river itself, we need to understand something about the ground beneath your feet. Wherever you happen to be in the central part of this continent, the ground has layers. This seems obvious when you say it out loud, but the implications of it are easy to underestimate. Every layer of soil represents time. The deeper you go, the further back you travel, and in the flatlands and river valleys of the American Midwest and South, you can travel back a very long way without even needing to go very deep. The Mississippi and its tributaries have been depositing sediment for tens of thousands of years, burying whatever existed at the surface under successive blankets of silt. Every time the river flooded, every time it jumped its channel and ran somewhere new, every time the climate shifted and the landscape reorganized itself around the new conditions. This means that there is an enormous amount of the archaeological record of this region that is simply underground. Not lost, exactly, because things that are underground are not gone, they are only hidden, but hidden in a way that makes them effectively invisible to a casual survey of the landscape, and accessible only to people who know where to look and have both the equipment and the funding to look there. Funding, as it turns out, is one of the perennial problems with North American archaeology in general and Mississippi Valley archaeology in particular. It costs a great deal of money to excavate properly, and the money tends to go towards sites that are already famous, already considered significant, already built into the existing narrative of what pre-Columbian North America was supposed to look like. The existing narrative, for most of the 20th century, went something like this. North America, before European contact, was inhabited by various groups of hunter-gatherers and simple farming communities, organized at the level of small villages or bands, without the social complexity, the engineering capacity, or the long-range communication networks that characterize civilizations elsewhere in the world. The level, they were in South America, in the Andes, among the Inca and the peoples who came before them. North America, north of the Rio Grande, was, according to this narrative, a kind of cultural backwater, vast and beautiful and populated by interesting people, certainly, but not by people who built cities or moved Earth on a massive scale, or studied the stars with the precision of trained astronomers. That narrative was always more comfortable than it was accurate. It was built partly on genuine ignorance, partly on selective attention, and partly on a set of assumptions about what kinds of people were capable of what kinds of achievements that we would now recognize as reflecting the biases of the people doing the assuming rather than the reality of the people being described. The monuments were always there. The earthworks were always visible. The evidence was always present in the ground. It simply was not being interpreted in a way that challenged the comfortable story. Partly because challenging comfortable stories requires a kind of intellectual courage that institutions do not always reward, and partly because the most dramatic evidence was hidden in the ground, hidden under the river, hidden in places that had been farmed for 150 years and would need to be completely excavated before they yielded their secrets. Hidden in the archives of early European explorers who wrote down what they saw, but whose accounts were later dismissed or minimized by scholars who could not reconcile the descriptions with what the landscape looked like by the time professional archaeology arrived on the scene. The Spanish were among the first Europeans to move through the Mississippi Valley in any systematic way. Hernando de Soto crossed the river in 1541, somewhere in what is now Arkansas or Tennessee, the exact location still debated by historians who have spent careers arguing about it. His chroniclers, the men tasked with writing down what they encountered, described something that is genuinely startling when you read it carefully, which is something that surprisingly few people have done. They described a populated landscape, densely, continuously populated. They described towns stretching for miles along the river, some of them quite large, with cleared fields and organized social structures, and leaders who commanded respect across significant distances. They described mounds, many mounds, great earthen structures rising above the floodplain, some of them serving as platforms for buildings, some of them clearly serving ceremonial functions, some of them of a size that clearly required coordinated labor over extended periods of time. By the time American settlers began arriving in force in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the landscape de Soto's chroniclers had described was almost unrecognizable. The towns were gone. The people were gone, or nearly gone, reduced by a century and a half of epidemic disease and warfare, and displacement from numbers that may have been in the millions to a remnant fraction of what they had been. The fields had returned to forest. The mounds remained, because you cannot make Earth disappear, but many of them had been damaged or reduced or built upon by the new arrivals who found them inconvenient or strange, or simply not as interesting as the land they sat on, which was excellent farmland and therefore valuable in a way the settlers understood immediately. But some of the early settlers and travelers were curious. Some of them looked at the mounds and asked questions. Some of them dug into the mounds, usually clumsily and destructively by modern archaeological standards, but sometimes with genuine intellectual curiosity And what they found inside those mounds was evidence of a sophistication that did not fit the simple story they had been taught about the people who built them. They found carefully arranged burials with grave goods that indicated long-distance trade. They found worked copper from the Great Lakes. They found marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico. They found objects of worked stone from quarries hundreds of miles away. They found evidence of craft specialization and social hierarchy and ceremonial practice of a kind that required stable, complex social organization to sustain. This created a problem. The problem was that the people they found evidence of in those mounds did not fit the category of simple hunter-gatherers that the prevailing narrative required them to be. But the solution that was adopted for a long and embarrassing period of American intellectual history was not to revise the narrative. The solution that was adopted was to invent a different group of people to credit with the mounds. These imaginary people came to be called the mound builders, and they were described as a lost race, a vanished civilization, mysterious and advanced, who had occupied North America before the ancestors of the current Native American population arrived and displaced or destroyed them. This allowed Americans in the 19th century to look at the mounds with genuine wonder, while simultaneously maintaining their belief that the people currently living on the land, the people whose descendants they were in the process of removing from that land, were not the kind of people who could have built such things. The mound builder myth was comprehensively debunked by Cyrus Thomas in 1894, following a systematic survey of hundreds of mound sites conducted by the Bureau of American Ethnology. Thomas's conclusion was clear. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the people who were still living in the region when Europeans arrived, or in some cases by people in continuous cultural tradition with those ancestors. The mounds were Native American. The civilization was Native American. The sophistication was Native American. Full stop. This should have been the beginning of a serious, sustained effort to understand what that Native American civilization actually looked like in its full complexity. In some ways it was. 20th century archaeology made genuine progress in mapping the extent of mound-building cultures, in dating their development and decline, in understanding their economic and political structures. But the old assumptions died slowly, and the funding for deep investigation of the Mississippi Valley's most dramatic sites remained limited. And the questions that the evidence kept raising were not always the questions that the scholarly community was most eager to pursue. The questions that kept coming up, if you looked at the evidence carefully and without ideological commitment to any particular answer, were questions like these. Why do some of the most impressive mound complexes in the Mississippi Valley show evidence of construction techniques that seem more sophisticated than the social organization of their builders would have been able to sustain, at least according to the models that archaeologists were using to describe those builders? Why do some sites show apparent astronomical alignments that required extremely precise observation over many generations to achieve? Why does the trade network implied by the artifacts found in burial contexts extend so much further, across so many more hundreds of miles, than the models predicted? And perhaps most persistently, why do the accounts of De Soto's chroniclers describe a populated and architecturally impressive landscape that seems to have simply vanished between 1541 and the time American settlers arrived in force? That last question has an answer that is both simple and devastating, and it is one of the most important facts about American history that most Americans do not know or have not fully absorbed. De Soto's expedition was a catastrophe for every community it contacted, not just because of the violence, though there was significant violence, but because the expedition members carried diseases that spread through the population ahead of the soldiers themselves, reaching communities that had never seen a European and would never see one before those diseases arrived. Smallpox and measles and influenza and a dozen other pathogens to which the indigenous population of North America had no prior exposure swept through the Mississippi Valley in waves over the century following first contact, killing, by some estimates, somewhere between 50 and 90% of the people they encountered. 90%. Let that settle for a moment. If 90% of the current population of the United States died in a single century, the landscape would look very different. The cities would be overgrown, the infrastructure would be crumbling, the fields would be returning to forest. And if someone arrived 200 years after the catastrophe and found only a remnant of the population still living among the ruins, it would be very easy to conclude that these people could not have built what they were surrounded by, that it must have been someone else, some earlier civilization, some lost race. This is almost exactly what happened in the Mississippi Valley. The civilization was real. The people who built it were real. The catastrophe was real. And the conclusions drawn from the landscape left behind after the catastrophe were wrong in ways that shaped everything that followed. Now, with all of that context in place, let us talk about what is actually in the ground along and beneath the Mississippi River and its major tributaries. Let us talk about the specific sites and the specific evidence and the specific mysteries that remain genuinely unresolved even now, after more than a century of serious archaeological investigation. Let us start with the largest, the most dramatic, the one that should be as famous as the pyramids of Egypt, and is instead known primarily to regional enthusiasts and the occasional traveler who happens to notice the signs on the highway. Let us start with Cahokia. Cahokia sits on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, directly across the river from what is now St. Louis, Missouri, in a part of Illinois called the American Bottom, which is the name given to the broad, flat floodplain that spreads out at the confluence of the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois rivers. The American Bottom is an extraordinarily fertile piece of ground, one of the most agriculturally productive river bottoms in North America, and for a period of roughly 300 years, from approximately 1050 to 1350 CE, it was home to the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. Cahokia at its peak held somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people within its central area, with a much larger dependent population spread across the surrounding region. It was organized around a grid of plazas and mounds, with a central plaza larger than some European city centers of the same period, dominated by a structure so enormous that archaeologists and writers have been reaching for comparisons ever since it was first professionally surveyed. Monk's Mound is the name it carries now, named after a group of Trappist monks who briefly occupied the site in the early 19th century. The name is an accident of recent history that has nothing to do with the people who built it or the purposes for which it was built. What it actually is an earthen platform mound measuring roughly 950 feet along its base from north to south and 800 feet from east to west, rising approximately 100 feet above the surrounding plain in 4 distinct terraces. It covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It contains an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth, moved and placed and packed and shaped by human labor without the benefit of wheels, draft animals, or metal tools of any kind. People sometimes respond to that comparison to Giza with a kind of competitive patriotism, as if the point is to establish that the people who built Monk's Mound were somehow equal to the ancient Egyptians, as if the comparison is what matters. But that is not really the point. The point is that an earthen structure of this scale, built in the middle of North America by people who are not supposed to have been organized at this level of social complexity, is genuinely remarkable on its own terms, without any comparison to anything else anywhere in the world. It represents an enormous investment of coordinated human labor, sustained over a period of time that required not just the ability to organize a large workforce, but the political and social institutions capable of maintaining that organization across generations. Someone had to plan this. Someone had to direct it. Someone had to feed and house and coordinate the people doing the actual work. Someone had to keep the vision alive as one generation handed it to the next. There was a building on top of the highest terrace of Monk's Mound. We know this because the post holes of a large wooden structure have been identified in the soil of the summit. The building was approximately 105 feet long and 48 feet wide, which makes it larger than many of the great halls of medieval Europe. It almost certainly served as the residence and ceremonial center of whoever ruled Cahokia, because everything about the site's layout suggests that the summit of Monk's Mound was the most symbolically important space in the city, the point from which the entire urban landscape was organized, the elevated ground from which the ruler both surveyed the city below and was visible to everyone within it. The view from the top of Monk's Mound, when you stand there now, is partially obscured by the trees that have grown up around the surrounding area. But when Cahokia was functioning at its peak, the landscape for miles around had been cleared for agriculture and settlement, and from the top of the mound you would have been able to see the entire urban complex laid out below you, the central plaza, the smaller platform mounds arranged around it, the neighborhoods of thatched roof houses extending outward in every direction, the wood henges, which we will get to shortly, the surrounding farmland with its carefully tended fields of maize and squash and sunflower, and beyond all of that, the river, gleaming in whatever light happened to fall on it, with the bluffs of Missouri rising on the far side and the great sky of the middle of the continent arching overhead. That view, that landscape, that city existed for 300 years and has been effectively invisible to mainstream American culture for most of the 2 centuries since American settlers began arriving in the area. The mounds were always there. Monk's Mound was always visible, but the context for understanding what it represented was absent, or rather was actively suppressed by the assumptions that governed the interpretation of North American prehistory. It was not until 1982 that Cahokia Mounds was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, joining the Pyramids of Giza and the Great Wall of China and Stonehenge and a small number of other places the international community considers to be of outstanding universal significance. Even now, the site receives a fraction of the visitors that comparable sites in other parts of the world attract, and the full extent of what Cahokia was and what questions it raises about the history of this continent has not fully penetrated the popular imagination. But let us not get too far into what Cahokia looked like at its peak, because the more interesting questions, the questions that matter for our purposes here, are the questions about what Cahokia knew and how it knew it, and what it might have been connected to that we have not yet found. Consider Woodhenge. Scattered across the area to the west of Monk's Mound, archaeologists excavating in the 1960s began finding post holes, large circular holes in the earth that had once held substantial wooden posts, arranged in precise circles. Several of these circles were identified, overlapping each other, which suggested that the wooden posts had been taken down and repositioned over time, that the circles were not permanent installations but working instruments, things that needed to be adjusted and recalibrated as time passed and astronomical observations were refined. The circles were given the name Woodhenge, by analogy with Stonehenge, which uses stone rather than wood to achieve similar purposes, and that analogy turns out to be more than superficial. When the positions of the post holes were mapped precisely and the circles reconstructed on paper, something became clear that is still somewhat astonishing to contemplate. The circles were solar calendars. On the day of the spring equinox, the sun rises directly behind Monk's Mound when observed from the center of the largest circle. On the day of the summer solstice, the sun rises behind a post at one edge of the circle. On the day of the fall equinox, Monk's Mound again. On the day of the winter solstice, the sun rises at the opposite edge of the circle. The cardinal positions of the solar year are precisely encoded in the arrangement of posts, and the center of observation is positioned so that Monk's Mound itself becomes part of the astronomical instrument, a fixed landmark from behind which the sun rises on the most symbolically important days of the agricultural calendar. This is not accidental. You cannot achieve this kind of astronomical precision by accident or by intuition. You achieve it through sustained, careful, methodical observation of the sky over many years, conducted by people who understand what they are looking at and why it matters. You achieve it through a tradition of astronomical knowledge that is itself the product of generations of observation and record keeping, passed down through whatever means the Cahokians used to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. You achieve it through a decision by the people building the city to encode that astronomical knowledge directly into its physical structure, to make the city itself a demonstration of their understanding of the sky. What this tells us is that the people who built Cahokia were not simply farmers and traders and warriors, though they were certainly all of those things. They were also people who understood their position in the cosmos with a precision and deliberateness that challenges any description of them as primitive or simple or early stage. They were sophisticated in the specific way that serious engagement with the natural world produces sophistication, and they chose to encode that sophistication in the landscape in ways that have survived for nearly 1,000 years and are only now beginning to be fully understood. But here is where the genuinely mysterious begins to layer in over the merely impressive, because Cahokia did not exist in isolation. The Woodhenge solar calendar at Cahokia is connected to a set of astronomical alignments that appear at other mound sites across the Mississippi Valley and beyond. Sites that were built at different times by cultures that are given different names in the archaeological literature, but that appear to have shared, or to have developed independently, similar understandings of celestial mechanics and similar commitments to encoding those understandings in earthworks. The question of whether these similarities represent direct cultural connection, the spread of ideas and practices along trade routes, or independent development of comparable solutions to comparable problems, is one that archaeologists are still working through, and it is a question that has significant implications for how we understand the organization and communication of knowledge in pre-Columbian North America. There is something even more specific that needs to be said about the astronomical alignments at Cahokia and related sites, something that most casual accounts of these places do not include, because it raises questions that are difficult to answer within the current frameworks of North American archaeology. The alignments at Cahokia are not limited to the solar positions of the solstices and equinoxes. There is evidence, and this evidence has been argued about intensively among specialists since it was first proposed, that some of the alignments at Cahokia and at nearby sites incorporate positions related to the lunar cycle, specifically the positions of the moonrise and moonset at the major and minor lunar standstills, which are points in the 18.6-year lunar cycle when the moon reaches its maximum northern or southern declination and appears to stand still at the horizon before reversing its course. Tracking the lunar standstills requires exactly 18 years and 7 months of continuous astronomical observation to detect a single complete cycle. Encoding the positions of the lunar standstills in the physical layout of a city requires not just the observational capacity to detect them, but the institutional memory to preserve that observational data across nearly 2 decades, and the architectural capacity to translate the recorded positions into precise physical alignments. This is not simple. This is not something that happens by accident or by casual attention to the sky. This is the product of a dedicated observational tradition maintained by specialists who understood what they were doing and why it mattered, embedded within a social structure that valued and supported their work over timescales that stretched far beyond any individual lifetime. The evidence for lunar alignments at some Mississippi Valley sites remains contested, because the methodology required to establish astronomical alignments in archaeological contexts is technically demanding, and the margin for error is narrow enough that reasonable experts disagree about where the evidence falls. But the solar alignments at Cahokia are not contested. The Woodhenge posts align with the solar year. Monk's Mound aligns with the equinoxes as seen from the primary observation point. These facts are established and published in peer-reviewed literature and are not seriously disputed by mainstream archaeologists. What they suggest about the knowledge and organizational capacity of the people who built Cahokia is simply staggering when you stop and think about it carefully, which is something that the mainstream presentation of this material does not always encourage you to do. We need to talk about the plaza. The central plaza at Cahokia, the open space that lies immediately south of Monk's Mound, is one of the most significant engineered spaces in the pre-Columbian world, and it is almost completely unknown outside a small circle of specialists and enthusiasts. It is enormous. It covers nearly 50 acres of precisely leveled ground, and here is the part that most people do not know. It did not start out level. The ground beneath it was not naturally flat. It was made flat. The Cahokians took a piece of ground that was uneven, that included natural ridges and low areas and slopes, and they engineered it to a uniform grade, hauling soil from some areas and depositing it in others, until the entire 50-acre space was a single level platform on which public activities could take place. The engineering challenge this represents is not trivial. To level 50 acres of ground to a uniform grade without surveying instruments, without levels, without any of the tools that modern civil engineers take for granted, requires a method for measuring and transferring elevations accurately across large horizontal distances, and it requires the ability to hold the target elevation in mind while doing work that takes place over days or weeks or months, with different teams working on different parts of the site simultaneously. The Cahokians solved this problem somehow. We do not know exactly how, because the method, whatever it was, left no direct physical trace. But the result is there. 50 acres of level ground that has maintained its engineered grade for nearly 1,000 years, which is itself a testament to how well the original grading was executed. What went on in that plaza? Gatherings, certainly. With a city of 20,000 people, you need spaces for public assembly, for ceremonies, for the events that bind a large community together and give it a sense of shared identity and purpose. The plaza would have been the site of political performances, of ritual events tied to the agricultural calendar and the astronomical observations encoded in the surrounding structures, of markets and celebrations, and the competitions and games that societies use to channel competitive energy into displays of skill rather than violence. Archaeologists have found evidence of chunky, a game played with a rolling stone disc and throwing spears, at Cahokia and at sites across a huge swath of eastern North America, and there is reason to believe that chunky was not simply a game, but a ritual and diplomatic practice, a way of establishing relationships between communities and encoding social hierarchies in competitive performance. The scale of chunky's distribution across the archaeological record is itself one of those things that the old narrative of North American prehistory has difficulty explaining. The game appears from the Mississippi Valley to the Atlantic coast, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, encoded in the same specific way, with the same specific stone discs ground to the same specific form. This kind of precise cultural uniformity across such enormous geographic distances does not happen by accident. It requires communication. It requires the movement of people and ideas across hundreds and in some cases thousands of miles. It implies a degree of connectivity between communities in pre-Columbian North America that is far more extensive than the conventional picture of isolated village-level societies would suggest. The trade networks that Cahokia sat at the center of were extraordinary by any measure. Copper from the Lake Superior region appears at Cahokia and at sites connected to Cahokia across a huge area. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico appear in burial contexts at Cahokia. Mica from the southern Appalachians appears at Cahokia. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains appears at Cahokia. Flint from quarries in Illinois and Ohio and Indiana appears at Cahokia and at sites distributed across an area of several 100,000 square miles. These materials do not travel themselves. They travel because there are networks of people moving them, trading them, carrying them along routes that were established and maintained and used over many generations, routes that crossed rivers and mountains and prairies, and passed through territories controlled by different communities, with different languages and different social organizations. The existence of these trade networks is not in dispute. The materials are in the ground. The provenance of the materials can be established through geochemical analysis. What remains less clear is the organizational infrastructure that supported those networks, the institutions and relationships and communication systems that made it possible to move goods across such enormous distances. And what is least clear of all is how far back those networks go. because Cahokia was not the first city in the Mississippi Valley. It was, as far as we can currently tell, the largest and the most complex. But the tradition of mound building in the eastern United States is far older than Cahokia, older than the Mississippian culture that Cahokia represents, older than most people realize, older in ways that raise questions the archaeological establishment has been slow to fully engage. How old? Let us go to Louisiana. Let us go to a place called Watson Brake. Watson Brake sits in the Ouachita River floodplain of northeastern Louisiana, and until 1997, it was not particularly well known outside the immediate region. Local people knew it, hunters and farmers knew it, but it was not a site that had attracted sustained scientific attention, partly because it sits on private land, partly because Louisiana has an enormous number of mound sites and the resources to investigate all of them simply do not exist, and partly because what it turned out to be was so unexpected that it took some time for the implications to fully register with the people studying it. Watson Brake is a complex of 11 mounds connected by an oval earthen ridge, enclosing an oval central space roughly 900 feet along its longest axis. The mounds vary in height from 3 to almost 30 feet. The entire complex is clearly intentional, clearly planned, clearly the product of sustained coordinated effort. What it is not, according to every model that archaeologists had previously developed for the emergence of complex social organization in North America, is something that should exist when it was built. Watson Brake was constructed starting approximately 5,400 years ago. That date needs a moment to breathe. 5,400 years ago. Cahokia was built starting roughly 1,000 years ago. Watson Brake was built nearly 4,500 years before Cahokia. Stonehenge, which is sometimes used as a reference point for ancient monumental construction in the popular imagination, was being built in its earliest phases at roughly the same time Watson Brake was being built. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 4,500 years ago, approximately 900 years after Watson Brake was begun. The people who built Watson Brake were, according to the archaeological evidence, hunter-gatherers. Not simple, unsophisticated people, but people without agriculture, without ceramics, without any of the technological or social developments that archaeologists had assumed were necessary preconditions for the kind of organized, communal construction that Watson Brake represents. They built it anyway. They invested the labor and the coordination and the planning that a project of this scale required, and they did it in a context that the existing models of social evolution in North America simply had not predicted and did not have ready-made explanations for. The discovery of Watson Brake's true age, confirmed through multiple rounds of radiocarbon dating, forced a significant revision of the timeline of monumental construction in North America. Prior to Watson Brake, the conventional wisdom had placed the beginning of mound building in the region at roughly 3,500 years ago, with the emergence of what archaeologists call the poverty point culture. Watson Brake pushed that date back almost 2,000 years, and it suggested that the capacity for organized communal construction in the lower Mississippi Valley was not a late development but something deeply embedded in the cultural traditions of the region, something that had been going on for much longer than anyone had suspected. But what does Watson Brake represent? Really? What was it for? This is where the investigation becomes genuinely difficult, because the people who built Watson Brake left no written records, and the oral traditions that might have preserved memory of it have been disrupted by the same catastrophic processes that disrupted everything else. We can describe what we find there. We can date it. We can map its layout and analyze the composition of its earthen structures and identify what materials appear in the contexts associated with its use. What we cannot do with any confidence is recover the meaning that the builders invested in it, the cosmological framework within which it made sense to spend this much effort on this particular arrangement of Earth. Some things are suggestive. The oval form of the site's enclosure bears resemblance to oval ceremonial spaces found at other mound complexes across the region, separated by thousands of years of time. This could be coincidence, or it could indicate that certain spatial concepts persisted in the cultural traditions of the lower Mississippi Valley with remarkable tenacity, encoded in the physical form of ceremonial spaces across millennia. The central open space within the oval is large enough to have accommodated significant numbers of people, which suggests that gatherings of some kind were part of the site's function. The mounds themselves, which vary enough in size and placement to suggest that they had different specific functions, may represent markers of astronomical alignments, storage for sacred materials, platforms for structures that have long since disappeared, or some combination of all of these things. What we know is that Watson Break was used for an extended period of time, hundreds of years at minimum, before it was apparently abandoned. And then the tradition of mound building in the lower Mississippi Valley continued, building towards something that is, in certain respects, even more extraordinary. Poverty Point is the name given to a site about 20 miles from Watson Break, also in northeastern Louisiana, also in the Ouachita floodplain, also formally recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and also almost completely unknown to the general American public in a way that is genuinely baffling once you understand what it is. Poverty Point was built beginning roughly 3,700 years ago, considerably more recently than Watson Break, but still vastly older than Cahokia or any of the Mississippian mound complexes. It was occupied and modified and expanded over a period of roughly 600 years, between approximately 1,700 and 1,100 BCE. It is one of the largest and most complex earthwork sites anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. The centerpiece of Poverty Point is a set of 6 concentric ridges arranged in a roughly semicircular pattern centered on a point that was once the western bank of Bayou Macon. The ridges are about 1 meter high and roughly 5 meters wide, and they extend for a total combined length of approximately 7.5 kilometers, or about 4.5 miles. The 6 ridges are separated by alleys of equal width, and the whole structure is divided into quadrants by pathways that run from the center of the semicircle to the open edge. Within the ridges, archaeologists have found evidence of habitation, the remains of structures and food preparation and daily activity, which suggests that the ridges were not simply ceremonial earthworks but also functioned as residential platforms, raising the living spaces of the site's inhabitants above the floodplain. The scale of labor required to build the Poverty Point ridges and to maintain them over the 600 years of the site's active use is comparable to the labor required to build the mounds at Cahokia. Contemporary estimates suggest that something on the order of 5 to 3.5 million cubic feet of earth were moved to create the ridge complex and associated mounds. This is an enormous amount of material to move without mechanized equipment, and it implies a substantial population committed to the project over an extended period of time, or a smaller population working intensively over a shorter period, or some combination of the two. But the labor scale is only one of the remarkable things about Poverty Point. Perhaps more remarkable is what the site's artifact assemblage tells us about the extent of the exchange networks it was connected to. The materials found at Poverty Point come from an almost unbelievable range of geographic origins. Shirt and flint from the Ozark Plateau of Missouri, soapstone from the Appalachian Piedmont of Alabama and Georgia, copper from the Great Lakes region, galena from Missouri and Illinois, novaculite from Arkansas, hematite from Arkansas and Missouri, steatite from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia and North Carolina. Even materials from what is now the Tennessee Valley and the coastal plains of the Gulf of Mexico appear in the Poverty Point artifact assemblage. Mapping the sources of these materials on a map of eastern North America produces something extraordinary. A web of connections extending from the Great Lakes in the north to the Gulf Coast in the south, from the Appalachians in the east to the Ozarks in the west, all converging on a single point in the lower Mississippi Valley. This is not a local or regional phenomenon. This is a continental-scale exchange network, organized around or through Poverty Point, sustained over centuries. And the people operating within this network were, according to the traditional reconstruction, hunter-gatherers without agriculture or ceramics, people who were not supposed to have developed the kind of social complexity and long-range communication infrastructure that this exchange network implies. Once again, the evidence does not fit the model. Once again, the conventional response has been to add qualifications and exceptions to the model, rather than to fundamentally revise it. And those qualifications and exceptions have accumulated to the point where the model itself no longer explains very much about what was actually happening in the lower Mississippi Valley during the second millennium BCE. There is something at Poverty Point that almost nobody talks about in the popular presentations of the site. Something that the peer-reviewed literature addresses, but that has not made it into the mainstream narrative of the site's significance. Poverty Point was designed with an astronomical orientation. The concentric ridges are arranged so that their open face, the flat edge of the semicircle, aligns with the position of the summer solstice sunrise. An observer standing at the center of the semicircle, at the point from which the radial pathways extend outward, would watch the sun rise directly over the open end of the ridges on the longest day of the year. This is not an accident of geography. This is a designed feature of the site, deliberately encoded in its layout by people who understood the solar calendar and chose to make it physically present in the most prominent built feature of their settlement. This places Poverty Point, along with Cahokia's Woodhenge, in a tradition of solar-oriented architectural design in the Mississippi Valley that extends from at least 3,700 years ago to approximately 900 years ago, across a span of nearly 3 millennia. The specific sites and the specific cultures are different across that span. The languages spoken at Poverty Point and at Cahokia were certainly different, likely unrelated. The social organizations were different, the economies were different, the material cultures were different. But the commitment to encoding astronomical knowledge in the physical layout of major sites, and specifically the commitment to marking the solar solstice in the orientation of built structures, is a thread that runs through the entire tradition. This is the kind of pattern that archaeologists of different theoretical orientations interpret very differently. Some see it as evidence of continuous cultural transmission, the persistence of specific cosmological ideas and their associated architectural expressions across many centuries of change and replacement. Some see it as independent development, different cultures independently solving the same problem of marking the solar calendar because the problem is universal and the solution, once discovered, is obvious and elegant. Some see it as something more complicated, a deep substrate of shared cosmological thinking that persists even through major cultural changes, because certain ways of understanding the human relationship to the cosmos are so fundamental that they survive the shifts in language and economy and social organization that otherwise transform. Cultures beyond recognition. Whatever the correct interpretation, the pattern is real, and it points to something that needs to be held in mind as we continue following the river northward. The Mississippi Valley was not a collection of isolated local cultures that happened to be building similar things by coincidence. It was, for at least 3,000 years, a space in which ideas and practices and cosmological frameworks moved, interacted, transformed, and sometimes persisted across distances and timescales that challenge our usual pictures of pre-Columbian North America. Now let us go upstream. Let us follow the river north and west, away from the Louisiana floodplain and into the broader Mississippi Valley, into the heartland of the continent, into the region where some of the most puzzling evidence of the deep American past lies buried under farmland and river bottom and the sediment of decades of neglect. The Ohio River meets the Mississippi at Cairo, Illinois, at the very southern tip of the state, at a place so geographically significant that it has marked an important junction in the American landscape, from the earliest moment of indigenous habitation to the present day. The confluence of two major rivers is always a significant location in the geography of hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies. Because rivers are highways, because confluences are crossroads, because the junction of two major waterways is a place where trade goods and information and people from different drainage basins converge and interact. The Ohio-Mississippi confluence has been a significant node in the human geography of eastern North America for at least 10,000 years, and the archaeological record of the region around it reflects this significance with an abundance and variety of sites that remains partially unexplored. But let us follow the Ohio upstream for a while before we come back to the Mississippi, because the Ohio Valley is home to a tradition of monumental construction that is in some ways even more mysterious than the Mississippian mound building that Cahokia represents. The culture responsible for this tradition is known by the name Hopewell, and Hopewell is one of those archaeological terms that conceals as much as it reveals about what it refers to. Hopewell was not a single culture in the way that term is usually understood. It was not a single polity, or a single ethnic group, or a single language community. What it was, at its core, was a widespread pattern of ceremonial practice and exchange, a complex of shared cosmological ideas and ritual behaviors that appears in the archaeological record from roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE across a huge area of eastern North America, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the Great Plains to the Atlantic seaboard. Archaeologists call this distribution the Hopewell interaction sphere, and the name is apt. It was an interaction, a network, a complex web of relationships between communities that were otherwise quite different from each other, connected by participation in a shared set of practices that involved the construction of large earthworks, the exchange of specific categories of prestige goods, and elaborate mortuary ceremonies that encoded cosmological beliefs in the treatment and deposition of the dead. The physical remains of Hopewell are astonishing. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, now unfortunately largely destroyed by the spread of the city of Newark but partially preserved in a state memorial site, were once the largest system of earthen enclosures anywhere in the world. The surviving portions include a great circle nearly 1,200 feet in diameter, and an octagonal enclosure of similar scale, connected by parallel embankments that once extended for miles across the landscape. The full extent of the Newark earthworks, as best as it can be reconstructed from early maps and surveys made before most of it was destroyed, covered more than 4 square miles of the Licking Valley in central Ohio. 4 square miles of precisely engineered earthen geometry, built by people who are classified in the archaeological literature as living in communities of modest size without centralized political authority. This is the Hopewell paradox, and it is one of the most genuinely puzzling things in the archaeological record of North America. The Hopewell earthworks, across their full distribution from Ohio to Illinois to Kansas to the Gulf Coast, represent an investment of labor on a scale that implies either a much larger and more centralized social organization than the archaeological evidence of the associated habitation sites suggests, or a different model of how communal labor was organized, recruited, and sustained than anything that fits comfortably within the standard categories of archaeological social theory. The earthworks of the central Ohio area, which includes Newark but also the Mound City complex, the High Bank Works, the Sipe Earthworks, the Hopewell Mound Group itself, and dozens of other sites distributed across the Scioto and Muskingum and Licking River valleys, are collectively the most impressive concentration of monumental earthwork construction in the pre-Columbian world north of Mexico. They are also among the most precisely engineered things ever built by any human society before the development of modern surveying technology. The geometric precision of the Hopewell earthworks has been noted by researchers since the first systematic surveys in the 19th century, but its full significance was not appreciated until relatively recently, when researchers began applying modern surveying technology and statistical analysis to the dimensions and orientations of the various enclosures. What they found was remarkable. The great circles at Newark and at Mound City and at several other Ohio Hopewell sites are true circles in the mathematical sense, with perimeters that deviate from perfect circularity by less than 3%. The octagonal enclosure at Newark is a true regular octagon, with sides that are within a few feet of equal length, despite being spread across a landscape that is not perfectly flat. The right angles in the various square and rectangular enclosures are within a fraction of a degree of 90 degrees. These are not approximate shapes or rough approximations. These are precise geometric forms, and achieving them on the scale at which the Hopewell earthworks are built, across terrain that varies in elevation and without the benefit of surveying instruments as we know them, required a highly developed system of measurement and geometric construction. What system? We do not know. The Hopewell people left no written instructions, no tables of measurement, no geometric manuals. We can only infer the existence of a measuring system from the precision of the results, and we can note that the dimensions of various Hopewell structures appear to be related to each other by simple ratios, which suggests that they were built to a common unit of measurement. Several researchers have proposed specific units based on the analysis of the archaeological data, with values ranging from approximately 1 to several meters, but there is no consensus on the specifics, and the question of what exactly the Hopewell measuring unit was remains open. What is even more remarkable, and what was not established until the 1980s and 1990s through a combination of precise surveying and astronomical analysis, is that the Hopewell earthworks are oriented to encode astronomical information in the same fundamental way that Cahokia's Woodhenge encodes it, but with a different and more complex astronomical target. The Newark earthworks are oriented to the lunar standstills. That claim deserves to be unpacked carefully, because it is not simple and because it has been contested, though the contestation has become less vigorous as the evidence has become more precisely documented. The Great Octagon at Newark, when surveyed with modern precision instruments, aligns along its major axis with the position of the moonrise at the northern lunar standstill, the point in the 18-year lunar cycle when the moon rises at its maximum northern declination. The minor axis of the octagon aligns with the moonrise at the southern lunar standstill. Other alignments within the complex mark the 4 intermediate positions of the lunar cycle. The entire octagonal earthwork is, in effect, a lunar observatory, or more precisely a lunar calendar, encoding in permanent Earth the complete cycle of the moon's movement against the horizon over its 18.6-year cycle. Detecting the lunar standstills requires 18 years of observation. Encoding them in a structure of this precision requires the ability to measure angles and distances to a high degree of accuracy and to transfer those measurements to the specific terrain of the construction site. And understanding that those alignments are there, recognizing that they are intentional rather than accidental, requires an astronomical sophistication that the scholarly community was slow to credit to the builders of the Newark earthworks. For the same reasons it was slow to credit comparable sophistication to other indigenous North American societies. The researchers who established these alignments convincingly, most prominently the archaeoastronomers Ray Hively and Robert Horn, who published their analysis in the 1980s, worked carefully and conservatively, and made every effort to account for chance alignment before concluding that the astronomical encoding in the Newark earthworks was intentional. Their work has been replicated and extended by subsequent researchers, and the consensus today within the specialist community that works on these questions is that the Newark earthworks are deliberately astronomically oriented, and that the astronomical knowledge encoded in them is genuinely sophisticated. This creates a picture of the Hopewell tradition that is significantly at odds with the popular understanding of it, and even with the standard textbook presentations of North American prehistory. The Hopewell people were not simply mound builders, they were astronomers. They had developed, or inherited from predecessors, a detailed understanding of the movements of the moon against the horizon over its full 18-year cycle, and they encoded that understanding in permanent earthen structures of sufficient geometric precision to serve as astronomical instruments, or at minimum as permanent architectural records of astronomical knowledge. They were doing this across the eastern United States during the first 500 years of the Common Era, at the same time that Rome was declining and early medieval Europe was struggling through its own transition in the middle of a continent that most subsequent observers would describe as the home of peoples who had not yet developed significant astronomical knowledge. The question of how the Hopewell tradition ended is almost as mysterious as the question of how it began. Sometime around 400 to 500 CE, the pattern of elaborate mortuary ritual and long-distance exchange that defines Hopewell in the archaeological record begins to decline and then effectively disappears. The large earthwork constructions are not maintained or extended. The exchange of prestige goods across the Hopewell interaction sphere decreases and then stops. The mortuary practices change. Within a few generations, the specific pattern of behavior that defines Hopewell as a coherent phenomenon is gone. What replaced it is archaeologically murky, a period sometimes called the Late Woodland, that is characterized by smaller settlements, simpler material culture, and apparently less complex social organization before the emergence of the Mississippian tradition, represented by Cahokia and its contemporaries, roughly 500 years later. The interruption between Hopewell and Mississippian is real, and it has never been fully explained. What happened to collapse the Hopewell network? Was it climate change? The disruption of the agricultural systems that underpinned the exchange network? Was it political collapse? The failure of the social and ideological system that maintained the Hopewell interaction? Was it epidemic disease? Some early wave of introduced pathogen that disrupted population and social organization, long before the more devastating epidemics of the post-Columbian period? We do not know. What we do know is that the tradition of mound building in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys did not end with Hopewell, that it persisted through the Late Woodland period and then revived dramatically with Mississippian, and that across the entire span, from Watson Break to the last Mississippian period mounds, the tradition represents a continuous engagement with the landscape that lasted for at least 5,000 years, making it one of the most persistent traditions of monumental construction anywhere in the world. That persistence is itself a mystery. Why the Mississippi Valley? Why this particular region, with its convergence of major river systems and its extraordinarily fertile floodplains, and its specific combination of natural resources? What was it about the geography of this part of North America that made it the site of such sustained investment in the transformation of the landscape? The ecological answer, that the Mississippi Valley offered an unusually rich and productive environment for human habitation, is part of the story, but cannot be the whole story. Rich environments exist in many parts of the world that do not produce 5,000-year traditions of monumental earthwork construction. The full explanation must include something about the specific character of the cultures that developed in this particular place, something about the cosmological frameworks and social institutions that led people in this valley, over and over again, across thousands of years and many changes of language and technology and political organization, to invest enormous collective effort in the transformation of the earth. There is a specific site that illustrates this persistence in a way that is almost overwhelming when you stand there and try to take it in, and it is a site that most Americans have never heard of, despite the fact that it is one of the largest earthwork complexes in the world and sits within a few hours' drive of several major metropolitan areas. This site is Serpent Mound, in Adams County in southern Ohio, and if you have not stood in it at night under a clear sky, you have missed one of the most powerful experiences the North American landscape offers. Serpent Mound is an effigy mound. It is an earthen sculpture in the shape of a serpent, built on a ridge above Brush Creek in the unglaciated hill country of southern Ohio. The serpent is enormous. From the tip of its tail, which is coiled in a triple spiral, to the tip of its head, which appears to be open, as if in the act of swallowing or disgorging an oval earthen form, the mound stretches approximately 1,370 feet, nearly a quarter of a mile. The body of the serpent undulates in 7 curves across the ridge, following the natural terrain in a way that suggests the designers were working deliberately with the landscape rather than against it, using the shape of the ridge to give the serpent a sense of dynamic movement that it would not have had on flat ground. Looking at Serpent Mound from above, which you can do from a modest observation tower constructed near the site, is one of those experiences that reorganizes something in the viewer's understanding of what the people who made it were capable of imagining and executing. The design is confident, sweeping, anatomically coherent in its representation of a massive snake in motion. The oval form at the head has been variously interpreted as an egg being swallowed, as the sun being swallowed at an eclipse, as the eye of the serpent, and as several other things, and the uncertainty about which interpretation is correct is part of what makes the site so enduring as a focus of inquiry. It does not resolve easily into a single obvious meaning. The dating of Serpent Mound has been revised several times and remains somewhat uncertain. The most recent detailed analysis suggests that the mound was built or significantly rebuilt around 1070 CE, which places it in the early Mississippian period and roughly contemporaneous with the Peak of Cahokia. An earlier phase of construction may date to the Hopewell period, though this is debated. What is clear is that the site was considered significant for a long time, that it was maintained and in some periods elaborated, and that it was placed at a location that itself has remarkable physical characteristics. The ridge on which Serpent Mound sits is the center of a large crypto-explosion structure, a roughly circular geological feature caused by a meteorite impact approximately 300 million years ago that produced a landscape of unusual complexity and variety, with rocks from depths of several miles brought to the surface in the disrupted geology of the impact zone. The people who built Serpent Mound knew, or seemed to know, that there was something unusual about the ground beneath them, something that had come from elsewhere, something that marked this place as different from the surrounding landscape. Whether they understood the geological explanation for that difference is unknowable, but they chose this specific ridge at the center of this specific geological anomaly as the site for the largest effigy mound in the world, and that choice, whatever its specific motivation, suggests a sensitivity to the character of the landscape that we are only beginning to fully appreciate. The astronomical orientation of Serpent Mound has been discussed and debated since the 19th century. The head of the serpent and the oval form at its mouth are oriented toward the summer solstice sunset, so that an observer standing at the coiled tail looking toward the head would see the sun set directly over the oval form on the evening of the longest day of the year. This alignment has been confirmed through precise surveying and astronomical calculation. It places Serpent Mound in the same tradition of solar orientation that we have traced from Poverty Point through Cahokia, and it connects it to a continuous thread of astronomical thinking and architectural expression that runs through 5,000 years of Mississippi Valley prehistory. But Serpent Mound is not in the Mississippi Valley itself. It is in the Ohio Valley, and its presence there is part of what makes the broader distribution of this astronomical tradition so striking. The commitment to encoding solar and lunar positions in major earthwork constructions was not limited to the Mississippi Corridor. It appears across a huge area of eastern North America, in different cultural contexts and different time periods, consistently enough that it must represent something more than independent invention at each site. There is a tradition here, a way of thinking about the human relationship to the cosmos, and a commitment to expressing that relationship in the transformed landscape, and that tradition crosses the cultural and temporal boundaries that the standard archaeological categories impose on it. What was that tradition? What cosmological framework underlay it? What was the content of the knowledge that was being encoded in these structures, beyond the simple astronomical facts of where the sun and moon rise and set at specific times of year? These are questions that the archaeological record, in itself, cannot fully answer, because the cosmological content of a culture is not fully represented in its material remains. We can see the structures, we can measure their orientations, we can confirm that they encode specific astronomical positions, but the meaning of those positions within the cosmological framework of the people who built the structures, the stories and beliefs and rituals that made the summer solstice sunrise sacred rather than simply notable, these are things that are only partially recoverable from the physical evidence. They are recoverable, in part, through ethnographic comparison with living and recently living indigenous traditions that maintain some connection to the same cosmological frameworks. The Osage, the Ponca, the Omaha, the Pawnee, and other nations of the central and southern plains have cosmological traditions that include sophisticated astronomical knowledge and that describe the movements of the sun, moon, and specific stars in ways that connect them to fundamental categories of meaning in the social and ceremonial life of the community. The Muskogee and Cherokee and Natchez of the Southeast have traditions that describe a tiered cosmological universe with the sky world and the underworld as complementary domains, balanced against each other in a dynamic that requires constant ritual maintenance to preserve. The specific content of these traditions varies across nations and has been transformed by the disruptions of the colonial period, but certain themes recur with sufficient consistency to suggest that they represent a deep substrate of shared cosmological thinking in Eastern North America. The serpent, in this cosmological substrate, is almost universally associated with the underworld, with the powers of the earth and water, with transformation and renewal, with the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The sun is associated with the upper world, with light and clarity and the powers of the sky. The relationship between the two is dynamic and sometimes antagonistic, requiring mediation by those who understand the nature of both domains and can move between them without being destroyed by either. If we read Serpent Mound within this cosmological framework, the serpent reaching toward the oval form, which may be the sun, takes on a specific meaning as an image of the fundamental cosmic drama that animates the universe. The tension between the powers of the below and the powers of the above, enacted permanently in Earth, so that it is always present in the landscape, always available as a point of mediation between the cosmic domains, always oriented toward the specific moment in the solar year when that tension is most acutely felt, because the light is at its maximum and the powers of the above are most fully expressed. This is speculation, but it is informed speculation, and it is the kind of interpretation that the evidence invites, even as it declines to fully confirm. The mound builders of the Mississippi Valley and its tributaries were not simply engineers who enjoyed moving Earth. They were people with a rich and sophisticated cosmological life, people who understood their place in the universe in ways that were specific and detailed, and expressed in everything from the orientation of their buildings to the goods they placed in the graves of their dead. Recovering that understanding, even partially, is one of the most important tasks facing the scholars who work on these materials, and it is a task that is made more difficult by the damage done to indigenous knowledge traditions by the colonial period. Let us go deeper into the river. Let us go down into the mud and sediment of the Mississippi itself and look at what the river is hiding, because what is on the surface, as impressive as it is, may be a fraction of what lies beneath. The Mississippi River does not stay where you put it. This is one of the most important facts about the river that most people who have not lived alongside it do not fully appreciate. The river moves not on the scale of days or weeks or even years, but on the scale of centuries and millennia. The Mississippi has moved enormously. It has changed its channel multiple times, abandoned old courses, cut new ones, built up its bed in some places and carved it away in others. The floodplain that the river occupies is, in geological terms, extraordinarily dynamic, and the history of human settlement along it is inseparable from the history of the river's movement. What this means for the archaeology of the region is both exciting and deeply troubling. Exciting because every time the river changes course, it potentially exposes material from earlier occupations that had been covered by later sediment. Troubling because every time the river changes course, it also destroys material, sometimes catastrophically, eroding sites that took generations to build, redistributing artifacts across miles of riverbed and bank, and burying the evidence of human habitation under meters of silt in places where it may never be excavated. The most dramatic example of this process in the historical period is the story of Cahokia's relationship with the river. At the height of Cahokia's power, around 1050 to 1200 CE, the Mississippi ran approximately 7 miles west of the city's center, and the area between the city and the river was intensively developed agricultural land, settlement, and infrastructure. The river in its present position, which has shifted significantly from where it was 1,000 years ago, runs through territory that was almost certainly part of Greater Cahokia's urban footprint, and portions of that footprint are now either underwater or buried under the river's accumulated sediment. There are sites associated with Cahokia that archaeologists know about and cannot access because the river runs over them. There are artifacts from those sites that have been eroded out of the riverbank by flood events and recovered by people walking the shore after the water recedes. There are portions of what was once the most complex urban landscape in pre-Columbian North America that are now fish habitat and river bottom, inaccessible to conventional excavation and only partially visible to the remote sensing technologies that have been developed for underwater archaeology. The loss is incalculable, not in the sense that it cannot be measured, but in the sense that measuring it requires knowing what is no longer there, which is precisely what we cannot do. But the river's movement has not only destroyed things, it has also preserved them, in a different kind of preservation than burial under stable soil offers. Material that ends up in the riverbed is sometimes protected by anoxic conditions, low oxygen environments in which organic materials do not decay in the normal way. Wooden structures that would be completely gone if they had been left on the surface can survive for centuries or even millennia in waterlogged anaerobic conditions. Boat-building traditions, architectural techniques using wood and fiber, organic components of tools and ceremonial objects, all of these can, in principle, be preserved in waterlogged conditions, even when they would be completely absent from dryland archaeological contexts. This is not just theoretical. The underwater archaeological record of the Mississippi Valley, small as it is given the practical difficulties of investigating it, includes materials that illuminate the pre-Columbian human landscape of the region in ways that dryland archaeology cannot. Dugout canoes, the primary watercraft of the Mississippi Valley peoples, have been found in riverbeds across the region in states of preservation that would be impossible in surface contexts. Some of these canoes are very old. A dugout canoe found in the Atchafalaya River basin in Louisiana dates to approximately 1,200 BCE, which places it in the Poverty Point period. A canoe found in Lake Phelps in North Carolina, part of the Atlantic drainage system but made by people who are part of the same broad cultural sphere, dates to approximately 4,400 years ago, contemporary with Watson Brake. These canoes tell us something that the conventional picture of pre-Columbian North America has not fully absorbed. The people of the Mississippi Valley were waterfarers, not in the sense of ocean voyagers or deep-sea navigators, though there is evidence of coastal and estuarine marine traditions in the Gulf region that are not fully understood, but in the sense of people who used rivers as their primary highways, who were thoroughly familiar with the behavior of waterways in all seasons, who could travel enormous distances by water, and who routinely did so as part of their participation in the exchange networks that connected their communities to others, hundreds of miles away. The canoe from the Atchafalaya is not an isolated find. It is part of a pattern of watercraft evidence from across the region that suggests a sophisticated tradition of river navigation extending back at least 4,000 years in the lower Mississippi drainage, and much longer if we are willing to accept the indirect evidence of exchange networks that could not have been maintained without river transportation. The materials that appear at Poverty Point from sources hundreds of miles away in every direction could not have been transported overland by small groups of people operating without draft animals. They had to come by water, and they had to come by water on a regular basis, season after season, generation after generation. What the river highways of the Mississippi Valley looked like at the height of Cahokia in the 11th and 12th centuries CE is something we can partially reconstruct from the archaeological evidence of the period. The river and its tributaries were arteries of commerce and communication, connecting a network of communities that ranged in size from small villages to substantial towns with regional, political, and ceremonial significance. Cahokia sat at the center of this network, occupying the most geographically significant position on the entire upper Mississippi system, at the confluence of the three major river systems that drain the heartland of the continent. Canoe traffic on the rivers leading to and from Cahokia during the height of the city's power must have been substantial, and the waterfront areas of the city and its satellite communities must have been characterized by the infrastructure of river commerce. Landing stages, storage areas, the workshops where goods were processed and prepared for trade, the quarters where visiting traders from distant communities were housed. None of this infrastructure survives in recognizable form. Wood decays, woven fiber decays. The physical markers of a busy waterfront, the landing stages and storage platforms and trading posts, leave traces in the archaeological record only if they were built in ways that included durable materials, and the waterfront infrastructure of the Mississippi Valley was almost entirely built of organic materials that are gone. What we are left with is the inference that such infrastructure must have existed, based on the evidence of what was being exchanged, and the physical reality of how it could have been moved, and the partial and suggestive evidence of occasional waterlogged finds that preserve fragments of the organic world that has otherwise vanished. There is a specific kind of site that the Mississippi River is hiding that has particular significance for understanding the depth and complexity of pre-Columbian civilization in the valley. These are the sites of the communities that flank the river itself, the towns and villages and specialized production centers that were strung along the banks of the river at close enough intervals to constitute a continuous inhabited corridor, and that were the most directly affected by both the benefits and the risks of river proximity. These sites are the most vulnerable to river channel migration and flood events, and they are the most likely to have been buried under subsequent sediment rather than exposed on the surface for excavation. Many of them are known only from fragments of their assemblages that appear in eroded bank cuts after major floods. When the river strips away layers of accumulated sediment and reveals the strata of earlier occupation beneath, the archaeologists who work on Mississippi Valley prehistory have developed a specific expertise in reading these bank cut exposures, recognizing what a particular type of soil or artifact cluster in a freshly eroded bank face means for what lies behind it, further back into the bluff or the terrace, still protected by the sediment that covers it. Bank cut surveys are now a standard part of the archaeological investigation toolkit in the region, and they regularly turn up evidence of sites that were previously unknown, sites that have been accumulating under sediment for centuries while the agriculture and development of the historic period transformed the landscape above them. What do these bank cut surveys find? The full diversity of Mississippi Valley prehistory, compressed into vertical profiles that represent thousands of years of human occupation in a few meters of soil. Stone tools from the Archaic period, spanning the thousands of years between the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of woodland cultures, mixed in with the sediment from the river's early post-glacial phase. Pottery fragments from woodland period communities, the characteristic ceramic traditions of the cultures that preceded Mississippian period ceramics and small objects, shell and bone and worked stone, from the communities that flanked the river during Cahokia's peak. Historic period materials from the Native American communities that survived into the colonial period, and in some cases, beneath all of it, materials from even earlier occupations, from the Paleo-Indian hunters, who were the first people to arrive in the Mississippi Valley at the end of the Ice Age, and who left traces of their passage in the deepest strata of the river's accumulated history. Those Paleo-Indian traces are among the most frustrating and tantalizing elements of the Mississippi Valley archaeological record because they are among the rarest and the most likely to have been destroyed or buried beyond easy access by the river's subsequent history. The first people to arrive in the Mississippi Valley came sometime between 13,000 and 15,000 years ago, at the end of the last glacial maximum, when the retreat of the ice sheets was making the interior of North America accessible to the descendants of the people who had crossed the Bering Land Bridge or arrived by Pacific coastal routes thousands of years earlier. These first arrivals encountered a landscape that was profoundly different from anything that exists today. Megafaunal animals that are now extinct, including mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths and horses and camels and a dozen other large mammal species that would disappear within a few thousand years of human arrival. A climate that was still in the process of transitioning from glacial to interglacial conditions, producing weather patterns and vegetation zones that have no modern analogue, and river systems that were behaving very differently from how they behave today, carrying enormous volumes of glacial meltwater and sediment and reorganizing the drainage patterns of the continent as the ice retreated. These first people left traces of their presence across the Mississippi Valley, mostly in the form of stone tool types that are characteristic of early North American occupation. Clovis points and their successors, the beautifully fluted projectile points that remain among the most aesthetically striking objects in the pre-Columbian archaeological record. But the sites where these people lived, camped, processed animals, maintained their tools, and in some cases buried their dead, are among the hardest to find in the Mississippi Valley, because they are the oldest and therefore the most deeply buried under subsequent sediment and the most likely to have been destroyed by the river's subsequent movement. There are a few places where the deep record is accessible, where erosion or other geological processes have brought early material close enough to the surface for excavation. And at these places, what we find challenges some of the assumptions that archaeologists have held about the earliest occupation of North America. The picture of early American archaeology that has dominated the field since the discovery of the Clovis culture in the 1930s has been one of relatively mobile hunters pursuing megafauna across the continent, leaving little permanent infrastructure and minimal evidence of the kind of place attachment and landscape transformation that characterizes later cultures. This picture is not entirely wrong, but it is increasingly being qualified by evidence of early sites that do not fit it. There is evidence in the Mississippi Valley of very early structured activity at specific locations, what look like repeatedly revisited camps with organized activity areas, and evidence of deliberate landscape management at an extremely early date. Not earthworks in the Hopewell or Mississippian sense, nothing architecturally dramatic, but the kind of repeated, structured engagement with a specific place that implies place attachment, implies the development of a relationship with a particular part of the landscape that extends over multiple generations. The oldest traditions of Mississippi Valley civilization, in other words, may have much deeper roots than even the Watson break date of 5,400 years would suggest. Roots that extend back to the earliest human occupation of the region, and that developed through thousands of years of accumulating familiarity with one of the world's most productive river systems. Let us think about what that long tradition means for the question of what is hidden beneath the Mississippi. We are not talking about a single civilization that built some impressive things and then disappeared. We are talking about a continuous tradition of human engagement with the Mississippi Valley that extends from the end of the Ice Age to the present, a tradition that produced wave after wave of cultural elaboration and complexity, each built on the foundations of what came before, each contributing to an accumulating body of ecological knowledge and cosmological understanding and engineering technique that was passed down through whatever means. Each successive generation used to transmit knowledge to the next. The hidden things beneath the Mississippi are not the relics of a single lost civilization. They are the accumulated residue of 10,000 years of continuous human civilization, buried in layers under a river that has been moving and depositing and eroding for all of that time. And here is something else to hold in mind, something that makes the hidden record of the Mississippi Valley even more significant than the physical scale of what is buried there. The traditions encoded in that record, the astronomical knowledge and the cosmological frameworks and the engineering techniques and the ecological management practices were not solely local traditions. They were connected through the trade networks and the interaction spheres and the patterns of communication and movement that we have been describing to the broader indigenous intellectual tradition of Eastern North America, and through that tradition to the entire pre-Columbian civilization of the Americas. The people of the Mississippi Valley were not isolated. They were not developing their extraordinary knowledge systems in a vacuum. They were in communication with the Maya world to the south, not through direct contact necessarily, but through chains of exchange that connected the Mississippi drainage to the Gulf Coast, and from there to the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. They were in communication with the Southwest, where the ancestral Puebloans and their predecessors were developing their own sophisticated astronomical and architectural traditions. They were in communication with the Northeast, where the Iroquoian and Algonquian traditions were developing in directions that are still not fully understood. The Mississippi Valley was not the periphery of American civilization. It was, for several thousand years, close to its center. The materials that demonstrate these connections are in the ground. The copper from the Great Lakes that appears at Poverty Point and Cahokia and 100 Hopewell sites in between. The marine shells from the Gulf that appear at sites from the Ohio Valley to the upper Mississippi. The obsidian from Yellowstone that appears at Hopewell sites in Ohio. The turquoise from the Southwest that appears in contexts associated with Mississippian culture at sites across the Southeast. These connections are not speculative. The materials are real. The distances they traveled are measurable. The networks that moved them were real, and they lasted for thousands of years. What those networks were carrying, in addition to the physical materials we can trace through geochemical analysis, was ideas. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the earthworks of the Mississippi Valley did not develop in isolation. It was part of a broader tradition of careful skywatching and astronomical record-keeping that appears across the Americas, from the Maya observatories of Mesoamerica to the astronomical alignments of Chaco Canyon in the southwest, to the medicine wheels of the northern plains, to the earthworks of the Ohio Valley. Whether these traditions were independently developed or connected through communication and exchange is one of the deepest unsettled questions in American archaeology, and it is a question that the hidden record of the Mississippi Valley, once it is more fully recovered, may have a significant role in answering. But that recovery is slow. It is underfunded. It is complicated by the political and legal frameworks governing archaeological investigation in the United States, which have been both improved by the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, and in some ways made more complicated by the legitimate concerns and rights of descendant communities that the Act recognizes. The investigation of a site like Cahokia or Newark or Watson Brake is not a simple matter of obtaining a permit and hiring a team of archaeologists. It involves consultation with descendant communities, respect for the sacred and ceremonial significance that these sites may hold, navigation of competing interests and legal frameworks, and always the fundamental challenge of funding work that does not produce immediately commercially valuable results. All of this means that the pace of discovery is slow relative to the significance of what is being discovered, and that significant portions of the pre-Columbian human landscape of the Mississippi Valley remain unstudied, understudied, or known only in outline. What we have recovered so far is already enough to challenge the old narrative fundamentally. What remains to be recovered may challenge it in ways we have not yet imagined. There is one more dimension of the hidden record of the Mississippi that we have not yet addressed, and it is in some ways the most speculative, and in other ways the most intriguing. It concerns not what is buried under the river or its floodplain, but what may lie on the bed of the Gulf of Mexico, at the mouth of the Great River System, in the places that were dry land during the height of the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than they are today. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, the sea level in the Gulf of Mexico was approximately 400 feet lower than it is today. What is now the northern Gulf of Mexico, the shallow continental shelf extending southward from the coast of Louisiana and Mississippi and Texas and Florida, was dry land. Not a small strip of coast, but an enormous area. Hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of low-lying coastal plain, drained by the Mississippi and its tributaries, which in that period extended their courses far out into what is now the Gulf, before finally reaching the ocean. This area, called the Gulf Coastal Plain or simply the Drowned Shelf, was habitable. It was not a frozen wasteland during the glacial maximum, because the Gulf Coast is far enough south that even during the coldest periods of the Pleistocene, it remained a temperate or subtropical environment. It would have been a different environment than the modern Gulf Coast, with different vegetation and different fauna and a different hydrological regime, but it was not uninhabitable. It was, in fact, probably among the most productive environments in North America during the glacial period, because the combination of riverine and coastal resources at the margin of the continental shelf would have made it a rich habitat for both the large terrestrial animals that were the primary food source of Paleo-Indian hunters, the marine and estuarine resources that coastal peoples exploit, the people who were present in the Mississippi Valley at the end of the Ice Age, the Paleo-Indians whose stone tools we find in the deepest layers of the region's archaeological record, were present at a time when the Gulf Shelf was dry land. Their communities, their camps, their processing sites, their living areas, the places where they were born and died and buried their dead, extended across that now submerged terrain. And when the glaciers melted and the sea rose over a period of roughly 10,000 years, those sites were progressively inundated and covered by the sea, buried under sediment on the continental shelf, preserved in conditions that may, in some cases, be as favorable to the preservation of organic materials as the anaerobic conditions in the deep river channels. The archaeology of submerged landscapes on continental shelves is a relatively new field, limited by the practical difficulties and expense of conducting systematic archaeological investigation underwater at depths of up to 400 feet over enormous areas. It has been practiced most extensively in the North Sea, where the shallow shelf between Britain and continental Europe, which was also dry land during the glacial maximum and supported substantial Mesolithic populations, has been the subject of systematic investigation for the past several decades. The results have been remarkable. The Dogger Bank, now a shallow underwater bank in the southern North Sea, was once a low-lying landmass with rivers and lakes and forests and the people who lived among them, and their tools and their organic refuse, and in some cases, the remains of their structures have been found preserved on the seabed and in the dredged material of fishing vessels that have been working these waters for centuries. The Gulf of Mexico shelf has received far less systematic archaeological attention than the North Sea shelf, partly because the United States has not invested in this type of research to the same degree as European countries, partly because the Gulf Shelf is deeper in the relevant areas and therefore more expensive to investigate, and partly because the research infrastructure for deep-sea archaeology in the Gulf has historically been oriented toward other priorities: oil and gas exploration, fisheries management, and the investigation of the many shipwrecks from the colonial and early American period that litter the Gulf's floor. But there is enough evidence from incidental finds, from artifacts dredged up by shrimping vessels, from surveys conducted as part of environmental impact assessments for offshore development, and from targeted investigations of specific anomalies identified by remote sensing, to suggest that the Gulf Shelf is not archaeologically empty. Stone tools have been found in dredged material from the Gulf. Mammoth bones and other Pleistocene megafaunal remains have been found on the shelf, sometimes in contexts that suggest human processing rather than natural death. Submerged tree stumps and peat deposits have been dated to periods when the shelf was dry land, providing environmental context for the kinds of habitats that would have existed there. Whether there are sites of the architectural or organizational sophistication of Watson Break or Poverty Point on the Gulf Shelf is something that nobody currently knows. The probability that such sites exist depends on whether the traditions of complex earthwork construction that we see beginning in the Mississippi Valley around 5,000 years ago had antecedents in the coastal cultures of the Gulf Shelf, cultures that developed during the period when that shelf was dry land and was subsequently drowned by the sea. If those antecedents existed, they may be preserved on the shelf in a form that would be recognizable to underwater archaeologists familiar with what they are looking for. This is not a fringe idea. It is a mainstream archaeological hypothesis, albeit one that is difficult and expensive to test. The question of whether the coastal peoples of the Gulf Shelf contributed to the development of the mound-building tradition in the Mississippi Valley is a legitimate research question, and the answer to it may require underwater archaeology on a scale that has not yet been conducted in the Gulf. The equipment and the techniques to do this work exist. The remote sensing technology that can identify anomalies on the seabed that might be archaeological in origin exists. What has been lacking is the sustained investment and the institutional commitment to applying these tools systematically to the Gulf Shelf in the way they have been applied to the North Sea. This is one of the genuine frontiers of Mississippi Valley archaeology, and it is a frontier that has barely been touched. It is possible that beneath the shallow waters of the northern Gulf of Mexico lie the physical remains of communities that participated in the earliest stages of the traditions that eventually produced Watson Break and Poverty Point, Cahokia. It is possible that the roots of the Mississippi Valley's 5,000-year tradition of monumental construction go back even further, to a drowned landscape that has been invisible to archaeologists for 10,000 years and will require underwater investigation to recover. That possibility is not a certainty. It may be that the Gulf Shelf communities, whatever form they took, were fully mobile hunter-gatherers who left no permanent architectural traces, and that the tradition of monumental construction that we see in the Mississippi Valley began indigenously in the valley itself without antecedents on the shelf. We simply do not know, because the relevant part of the record is underwater and has not been systematically examined. What we do know is that the question of origins, the question of where the extraordinary traditions of the Mississippi Valley came from and how they developed, is not fully answered by anything we currently have. Watson Break is 5,400 years old and already represents a mature tradition of organized earthwork construction. Before Watson Break, the archaeological record of the lower Mississippi Valley is less dramatic. The sites are smaller, the material culture is less complex, but the people were there, and they were doing things, and some of those things are only partially visible in the record we have. The full story of how Watson Break came to be may require going back further in time than any existing Mississippi Valley site can take us, and it may require looking in places that are currently inaccessible, whether because they are underwater or because they are buried too deep under the accumulated sediment of thousands of years of river activity, or because they are in areas that have been so thoroughly transformed by subsequent land use that the archaeological evidence is gone. But let us return to the surface, because there is more to find above the waterline. There are specific sites in the Mississippi Valley that have not received the attention they deserve, sites that raise questions that are genuinely unresolved, and that point toward aspects of pre-Columbian civilization in the region that are not adequately captured by the standard presentations of the subject. Some of these sites are well documented in the specialist literature, but poorly known to the general public. Some of them are partially investigated but not fully understood, and a few of them are known primarily through early historical accounts and partially confirmed by subsequent archaeology, existing in that uncertain space between documented reality and historical legend. One of these is the Emerald Mound site in Mississippi. Emerald Mound sits on a ridge above St. Catherine Creek in Adams County, Mississippi, a few miles east of Natchez, and it is the second largest earthwork in the United States, after Monk's Mound at Cahokia. It is an enormous platform mound, measuring roughly 770 feet by 435 feet at its base, with a surface area of approximately 8 acres, all of it raised to a uniform height of approximately 35 feet above the surrounding terrain. On top of this primary platform, there are 2 secondary mounds, both substantial structures in their own right, rising another 30 feet or so above the surface of the primary platform. Emerald Mound was built and used by the people of the Natchez tradition, a Mississippian culture that persisted in the lower Mississippi Valley well into the historic period, and provided some of the most detailed early ethnographic accounts of Mississippian social organization that we have. The Natchez were observed and described by French colonists in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, before the French effectively destroyed them through a combination of military action and enslavement in the 1730s. What the French observed among the Natchez is remarkable, and is directly relevant to understanding sites like Emerald Mound and Cahokia. The Natchez had a paramount chief, whom the French called the Great Sun, who was regarded as a divine or semi-divine figure, a living embodiment of the sun's power on earth. The Great Sun lived on a mound, ate with special utensils that were handled only by designated attendants, was carried everywhere in a litter and did not touch the ground, and was attended by a retinue of sun worshippers whose elaborate ceremonial dress and ritual behavior astonished the French observers. When the Great Sun died, his wives and a substantial number of attendants were strangled so that they could accompany him to the afterlife and continue their service there. This is the practice that archaeologists call retainer sacrifice, and evidence of it appears in the archaeological record of Cahokia and other Mississippian sites in ways that were deeply disturbing to the researchers who first recognized what they were seeing. At Cahokia, a burial complex excavated in the 1960s and known as Mound 72, contained the remains of what appears to have been an elaborate mortuary ceremony involving the interment of a high-status individual surrounded by the sacrificed bodies of numerous attendants, mostly young women. The central individual was laid on a bed of 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird, which has led some researchers to interpret the burial as that of a major Cahokian ruler, perhaps even the founder of the city's political order. Surrounding this central burial were pits containing the bodies of people who had been killed specifically for this ceremony, their manner of death visible in the skeletal remains. The Natchez ethnography makes these burials comprehensible in a way that pure archaeological analysis cannot. The Natchez told the French that the Great Sun was the representative of the sun on earth, that his power was derived from and identical with the power of the sun itself, and that the elaborate ceremonies surrounding his life and death were necessary to maintain the cosmic order, to keep the sun moving through the sky and the seasons following their proper sequence. This is a specific cosmological framework, and it maps almost perfectly onto the archaeological evidence from Cahokia, including the solar orientations of the Woodhenge, the central placement of the Great Platform Mound within a solar calendar, and the elaborate mortuary practice involving the sacrifice of attendants who would serve the ruler in the next world. The connection between the Natchez and the Mississippian archaeological record of Cahokia is not a matter of speculation, but of cultural continuity. The Natchez were the southernmost surviving representatives of the Mississippian tradition at the time of European contact, the community that had maintained the ritual and political framework of the Mississippian world long after most of its other expressions had already been disrupted by epidemic disease. Their practices give us a window into what Cahokia's social and ceremonial life might have looked like, and that window reveals a world of formidable sophistication and internal coherence. But there are things about the Natchez and the Mississippian tradition that the French observers noted and that remain unexplained, or only partially explained, even in the light of the broader archaeological record. The Natchez had a system of hereditary social classes that is unusually complex and that has puzzled anthropologists since it was first described. The system distinguished 4 social grades, with the top grade being the sons, the semi-divine lineage of the paramount chief, and the lower grades being nobles, honored men, and stinkards, the last being the commoner population. What makes this system unusual is a rule that all members of the son lineage must marry stinkards, the lowest social grade, while children of these marriages inherit their mother's social status. If the mother is a son, or their father's status if the father is a son, a rule that produces a complex and counterintuitive pattern of social mobility across generations. Anthropologists who have analyzed this system have noted that it has the mathematical property of equilibrating the social structure over time, preventing the son lineage from expanding without limit and preventing the stinkard class from shrinking to zero. Whether this mathematical property was recognized and deliberately designed by the people who established the system is unknown, but its existence raises interesting questions about the level of social analysis that went into the construction of Natchez political organization. The Natchez cosmology, as described by the French, was centered on the sun and involved a complex theology of cosmic zones and the beings that inhabited them, connected to the physical world through specific ritual practices maintained by the Great Sun and his court. The temple at the Natchez capital, which sat on a mound and contained an eternal fire tended by dedicated attendants, was the point of connection between the human world and the cosmic order, the place where the rituals that maintained the cosmic balance were performed. This temple and the mound it sat on are gone now, destroyed in the French campaigns of the 1730s. But the description of the temple, combined with the archaeological evidence from other Mississippian mound sites, allows us to understand what the major platform mounds of the Mississippian tradition were actually for. They were platforms for temples, the buildings where the cosmic maintenance rituals were performed, elevated above the surrounding landscape, so that they were literally closer to the sky, literally between the human world below and the heavenly world above. The mound builder was not simply a civil engineer. The mound was not simply a platform. It was a cosmological instrument, a physical embodiment of the axis mundi, the world axis, the connection between the domains that the tradition understood as structuring the universe. This cosmological understanding, once you have it, transforms your experience of visiting a place like Cahokia or the Natchez Mounds or any of the major Mississippian sites. These were not simply public spaces or political capitals, though they were those things too. They were, first and foremost, sacred landscapes, spaces that embodied the cosmic order and provided the physical context for the rituals that maintained it. The orientation to the sun was not decorative. The height of the mounds was not simply impressive. The placement of the mounds around the central plaza was not arbitrary. Everything about these sites was meaningful in a cosmological framework that understood the physical world as a direct expression of cosmic principles, and that required the constant, careful ritual performance of the patterns that maintained cosmic order. Understanding this does not make the engineering less impressive. It makes it more so, because it means that the engineering precision of Cahokia and the Hopewell earthworks and Poverty Point was not simply a technical achievement, it was a theological one. Getting the solar alignment right was not a matter of aesthetic preference. It was a matter of cosmic necessity. The woodhenge had to be accurate because the ceremonies performed there required that the sun rise exactly where it was supposed to rise, that the relationship between the human world and the cosmic order be confirmed through precise physical observation. The earthworks had to be geometrically precise because they were encoding cosmological truths in the landscape, and cosmological truths do not admit of approximation. This is the world that lies hidden beneath the Mississippi. Not just structures and artifacts, not just engineering achievements and trade networks, but an entire way of understanding the human place in the cosmos. Encoded in earthen architecture, transmitted through generations of ritual practice, and connected through networks of exchange and communication to similar ways of understanding the cosmos across the entire pre-Columbian world. And it is still there, buried, certainly, partially destroyed by the river and by agriculture and by development, but still there, in the ground, in the river, in the stories that descendant communities have maintained through all the disruption of the colonial period, still waiting to be recovered in its fullness, still holding secrets that we have not yet found the right tools or the right questions to unlock. Let us look at some of the specific mysteries that remain, the specific things about Mississippi Valley archaeology that cannot currently be explained within the frameworks we have, the places where the evidence points towards something we do not understand. There is a particular category of archaeological evidence that researchers working in the Mississippi Valley have learned to treat with a specific kind of careful attention. It is the category of things that appear where they should not appear, when they should not appear, in quantities or qualities that exceed what the standard models predict. These anomalous finds are not necessarily evidence of something exotic or supernatural, but they are evidence that our models are incomplete, that what we think we know about pre-Columbian North America is missing pieces that the ground keeps trying to put back in front of us. Consider copper. Copper in the pre-Columbian cultures of North America is not simply a material, it is a cosmological substance. It is associated with the upper world, with the sun, with the powers of light and heat and regenerative energy. It appears in elite burial contexts across the eastern United States, with a consistency and a quantity that speaks to its fundamental importance in the ceremonial life of Mississippian and Hopewell cultures. And the source of that copper, in the overwhelming majority of cases across a huge geographic range, is a single place, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where native copper deposits in the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale were worked by extraction and cold hammering for thousands of years. The Old Copper Complex, as it is known in the archaeological literature, is the oldest tradition of metalworking in North America by a significant margin. It began, current evidence suggests, approximately 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, and was practiced continuously for thousands of years by the people of the Great Lakes region. The products of this metalworking tradition, copper tools and ornaments of extraordinary variety and technical sophistication, appear in archaeological contexts across the eastern United States from very early dates, showing up in places like Watson Break and Poverty Point as evidence of long-distance exchange connections that were operating thousands of years before Cahokia or Hopewell. The scale of copper extraction and working in the Old Copper period is genuinely staggering when you try to reconstruct it from the evidence. Estimates based on the number of extraction pits identified in the Keweenaw Copper District and the quantity of native copper that has been removed from the region suggest that something on the order of 500,000 kilograms of copper were extracted from the Lake Superior region over the full span of Old Copper and subsequent working periods. That is 500,000 kilograms, or roughly 500 metric tons, of metallic copper extracted without metallurgy in the modern sense, without smelting or alloying or any of the high-temperature processes that characterize copper technology in the Old World. Where did it all go? This is one of the genuine mysteries of Eastern North American archaeology. The copper that has been recovered from archaeological sites across the eastern United States, impressive as the quantities are, cannot account for all the copper that was extracted from the Lake Superior deposits. A substantial portion of the copper that was worked in the Old Copper period and in the Hopewell and Mississippian periods that followed it is simply not accounted for in the archaeological record. It could be that significant quantities of copper artifacts are still in the ground, in sites that have not been excavated or have not been found. It could be that some copper was recycled, melted down and reworked, in traditions of metal use that are less visible archaeologically than the deposition of objects in burial contexts. It could be that some of the copper entered trade networks that distributed it to places where we have not looked for it, or to users that did not involve deposition in the kinds of contexts that archaeologists typically investigate. Or it could be something else, something that the current models of pre-Columbian exchange and social organization do not have a ready category for. The quantity of copper extracted from the Lake Superior region over the full span of its working history represents an industrial-scale operation in the context of pre-Columbian North America, an operation that required not just the technical knowledge to identify and extract native copper, but the organizational capacity to coordinate extraction activities across a large geographic area, the transportation infrastructure to move the copper from the extraction sites to the places where it was worked and traded, and the economic and political relationships that made all of this activity worthwhile to the people involved. This is not the picture of pre-Columbian North America that the standard narrative provides. The standard narrative does not include industrial-scale mining operations, sustained transportation networks, and the kind of surplus production that a 500 metric ton extraction represents. But the evidence is in the ground, in the form of thousands of extraction pits, hammering stones, and workshop debris that document the scale of what was happening in the Lake Superior Copper District over thousands of years. Something was organized enough, sustained enough, and directed enough to extract and distribute that much metal, and we do not fully understand what it was. The copper mystery is one instance of a broader pattern in Mississippi Valley archaeology. The pattern of evidence that implies a more complex and more extensive social organization than the standard models predict. Other instances of this pattern include the following. The road system. There is evidence, partially documented and partially hypothetical, of a network of maintained travel routes connecting the major centers of the Mississippian world. Roads in the modern sense, with graded surfaces and drainage infrastructure, are not something that the standard picture of Mississippian society includes. But there are specific corridors across the landscape, visible in the form of linear earthen features and in the spatial distribution of sites and artifact assemblages, that suggest the existence of maintained travel routes serving the same function as roads, channeling movement along specific paths, facilitating the efficient transfer of goods and people between centers, and potentially encoding social relationships in physical form by connecting specific places with specific other places through deliberate spatial infrastructure. The best documented evidence for this kind of infrastructure comes from Cahokia, where aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed linear features extending outward from the city in several directions, aligned with each other and with the site's internal layout in ways that suggest deliberate planning. The features are subtle, not the obvious earthen constructions of the mounds themselves, but slight changes in the soil and vegetation that are consistent with a maintained surface that received heavy foot traffic over an extended period. Whether they represent true roads in the engineering sense is debated, but the spatial pattern they form is not easily explained as coincidence. The agricultural question. The scale of the Cahokia population, estimated at 10 to 20,000 in the city itself, with a much larger dependent population in the surrounding region, implies an agricultural system capable of producing a substantial surplus. The American bottom, in which Cahokia sat, is extraordinarily fertile bottomland, and the maize-based agriculture that Mississippian cultures practiced was capable of generating significant yields per acre under good conditions. But feeding the non-farming population of a city the size of Cahokia, feeding the full-time craft specialists, and the priests and the administrators, and the laborers who built and maintained the mounds, requires a level of agricultural surplus and the infrastructure to collect, store, and distribute it that the standard archaeological models for Mississippian society have only partially accounted for. Where are the granaries? Where are the storage facilities that held the surplus that kept Cahokia's urban population fed through the winters and through the years when the harvest was poor? They should be there, somewhere in the archaeological record of the American bottom. Large quantities of stored food require large storage structures, and large storage structures leave detectable archaeological signatures. Some storage evidence has been found, but not at the scale that the population figures imply, which suggests either that the storage was occurring in locations that have not been investigated, or that the agricultural organization of Cahokia worked differently from what current models predict. These are not mysteries in the sensational sense. They are not evidence of alien intervention or of a vanished superintelligence that built the mounds. They are evidence that the people of pre-Columbian North America were doing more complex and sophisticated things than the standard story gives them credit for, and that the archaeological investigation of the Mississippi Valley, while it has made remarkable progress in the past century, has not yet recovered enough of the record to fully understand what those people were doing and how they were doing it. The most honest thing we can say about Cahokia, about Poverty Point, about the Hopewell earthworks, about the entire tradition of monumental construction in the Mississippi Valley is this: what we know is impressive, and what we do not know is likely to be more impressive still. Every decade of serious archaeological investigation in this region produces discoveries that require revision of previous understandings. The past 50 years have seen the age of Mississippi Valley civilization pushed back from 3,000 years to 5,400 years, with strong hints that it may go back further still. They have seen the astronomical sophistication of the earthwork builders confirmed in ways that were not suspected a generation ago. They have seen the scale of the Hopewell Exchange network documented in detail that was not previously available. And they have seen, in the emerging field of LiDAR archaeology, a tool that has the potential to reveal the full extent of the transformed landscape of the Mississippi Valley in a way that no previous technology has made possible. LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, is a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses to map the surface of the Earth with high precision. When applied from aircraft to landscapes covered by vegetation, it can strip away the forest canopy digitally and reveal the bare earth beneath, showing the subtle topographic features of the ground surface in detail that would be invisible to a person walking through the forest and difficult to detect, even with conventional aerial photography. In the past decade, LiDAR surveys of previously uninvestigated parts of the Mississippi Valley have revealed earthwork features that were not previously known to exist, including low platform mounds and earthen enclosures and linear features that had been completely invisible beneath the vegetation cover of the forests that have grown up over abandoned agricultural land. The most dramatic applications of LiDAR in American archaeology have been in Mesoamerica, where surveys of the Guatemalan jungle have revealed an extraordinary network of Maya sites and connecting infrastructure that completely transforms the understanding of Maya civilization's geographic extent and density. Similar surveys in the Mississippi Valley have been less dramatic, because the earthwork tradition of eastern North America leaves different kinds of topographic signatures than the stone architecture of the Maya, but they have nonetheless been revealing, consistently showing that the density of archaeological features in the region is higher than was previously known, and that significant earthwork sites remain to be investigated, even in areas that were thought to be well surveyed. The full LiDAR coverage of the Mississippi Valley and its major tributaries has not been completed. The technology is available, the aircraft exist, the processing pipeline is established, but the systematic application of LiDAR to the full extent of the region that was occupied by Mississippian and earlier cultures has not yet been funded and executed. When it is, the expectation among specialists is that it will reveal a significantly larger and more complex archaeological landscape than the one that is currently mapped, potentially including major site complexes that are currently completely unknown and that fill in portions of the story that are currently blank. This is one of those areas where the pace of discovery genuinely depends on investment, and where the investment gap has real consequences for understanding. Every year that passes without systematic LiDAR coverage of the remaining unsurveyed areas of the Mississippi Valley is a year in which agricultural disturbance, erosion, and development continue to damage or destroy sites that have not yet been documented. The window of opportunity is not closing quickly, but it is closing, and the question of what will be discovered before it closes and what will be lost before anyone looks is one that deserves more urgency than it currently receives. Beyond LiDAR, there are other tools that are being applied to the mystery of what lies beneath and around the Mississippi that are beginning to produce results. Ground-penetrating radar, which can image subsurface features without excavation, has been used at Cahokia and at several other sites to reveal buried structures and activity areas that were not visible on the surface. Magnetic survey, which detects disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the burning of hearths and the differential settling of different soil types, has been used to map the layout of buried settlements around major mound sites. Electrical resistivity tomography, a technique borrowed from geophysics, has been applied to some sites to map subsurface features in 3 dimensions. These techniques are transforming the practice of North American archaeology in the same way that they have transformed archaeology in other parts of the world, allowing researchers to understand the layout and extent of sites without the expense and irreversibility of full-scale excavation. What they are revealing in the Mississippi Valley is a denser, more complex, more extensively transformed landscape than the one that surface survey and limited excavation had mapped. The American bottom around Cahokia is not a landscape with a central city and a scattering of smaller communities. It is an intensively developed agricultural and settlement landscape, with sites and features distributed across every habitable piece of terrain, connected to each other by patterns of movement and communication that are only beginning to be mapped. The picture that is emerging from this ongoing investigation is not yet complete. It may never be complete, because too much has been lost to the river and to time and to the transformations of the agricultural and industrial periods. But what is emerging is already enough to force a reckoning with the old narrative, enough to require a fundamental revision of what we think we know about the human history of the North American continent, enough to demand that we take seriously the question of what pre-Columbian North America actually was, rather than what we were taught it was. What it actually was, to the extent that we can currently reconstruct it, was this: a continent inhabited by peoples of extraordinary diversity and sophistication, organized at levels of social complexity that ranged from small bands to complex chiefdoms to what may have been true states, connected across enormous distances by trade networks and communication systems, and shared cosmological frameworks that gave a common character to wide areas of cultural variation, engaged in continuous traditions of landscape transformation and astronomical observation and agricultural development that stretched back thousands of years before European contact, and possessing bodies of knowledge about the natural world, about the sky, about the behavior of plants and animals and rivers and weather, that rivaled anything being developed in the contemporary civilizations of the Old World. This is what is hidden beneath the Mississippi, not a single lost civilization, not a single dramatic secret waiting to be revealed, but the accumulated residue of 10,000 years of sophisticated human life in one of the world's most productive river systems, buried under sediment and water, and the accumulated weight of a historical narrative that spent too long looking in the wrong directions with the wrong assumptions. The unburying is happening, slowly, but it is happening. And as it happens, as each new survey reveals another site, and each new analysis adds another layer to our understanding of what these cultures were doing, and how they were connected and what they knew, the question becomes not just what is hidden, but what it means that it has been hidden. What does it mean that the continent that European settlers arrived in was not an empty wilderness, but a densely populated and architecturally transformed landscape? What does it mean that the societies which inhabited that landscape had been developing sophisticated knowledge systems and complex social organizations for thousands of years before contact? What does it mean that those societies were devastated by introduced disease to such an extent that the landscape which greeted the settlers appeared empty and always had been? These are not just archaeological questions. They are historical and ethical and political questions, and they bear on how Americans understand their own relationship to the land they inhabit, the history of that land, and the responsibilities that come with inheriting a landscape whose previous inhabitants left it far richer and more managed and more extensively transformed than they were given credit for. Coming to terms with the full depth of pre-Columbian civilization in North America is not simply an academic exercise. It is part of the larger reckoning with American history that the 21st century is demanding in multiple domains simultaneously. There is something specific that happens when you stand at the top of Monk's Mound at Cahokia and look out over the American bottom toward the bluffs on the Missouri side of the river. If you go at the right time of year, around the equinoxes, you can watch the sun set directly over those bluffs in the west, in alignment with the site's solar orientation, and feel for a moment the specific quality of attention that the people who built and used this place were bringing to the sky. The quality of sustained, careful, reverent observation that made the woodhenge possible, that made the equinoctial alignment of the entire site possible, that made 300 years of continuous urban life in the middle of the North American continent possible. That quality of attention is what the hidden history of the Mississippi Valley asks us to recognize. Not superpowers, not ancient aliens, not lost races or vanished superintelligences, but human intelligence applied with extraordinary consistency and sophistication to the challenge of understanding and inhabiting a particular piece of the earth over a timescale that dwarfs anything we usually associate with the word civilization. The people of the Mississippi Valley were civilized, deeply and enduringly, and in ways that are still revealing themselves to us, and the ground beneath the river is still full of what they knew. Let us turn now to a question that has been implicit in everything we have discussed so far, but that deserves to be addressed directly. The question of collapse. Why did Cahokia end? Why did the Hopewell interaction sphere collapse? Why did the great tradition of mound building in the Mississippi Valley produce such dramatic rise and fall cycles, with periods of apparent intensification followed by apparent abandonment and dispersal? This is not an abstract academic question. It is a question about the limits of human social organization, about the kinds of stress that complex societies can sustain and the kinds they cannot. And it has implications that extend well beyond the pre-Columbian period. Cahokia's decline is one of those historical puzzles that becomes more interesting the more carefully you look at it, because the standard explanations, which involve environmental degradation, political instability, and climate change, are all probably partially correct, and none of them is fully sufficient on its own. The timing of Cahokia's decline is relatively clear. The city reached its peak population and organizational complexity sometime around 1050 to 1100 CE, and began a process of apparent depopulation and disorganization that had largely concluded by 1350 CE, when the site appears to have been essentially abandoned as a major population center, though not necessarily as a sacred or symbolically significant place. 300 years of apparent florescence, followed by 200 years of decline, producing by 1350 what the landscape shows today, an empty site with the mounds still standing but the city gone. The environmental explanation begins with what archaeologists can see in the pollen record and the sediment cores from the American bottom and the surrounding region. The area around Cahokia shows signs of significant deforestation during the city's peak period, which makes sense given that 20,000 people require fuel and building materials and agricultural land, and that all of these things come, ultimately, from cutting trees. Deforestation at the scale implied by Cahokia's population would have had cascading effects: increased erosion, changes in the local water cycle, reduced soil fertility in some areas, increased flooding vulnerability in others, and a general degradation of the ecological productivity that underpinned the city's ability to feed itself. There is also evidence from the geological record of a major flood event around 1100 CE that appears to have been unusually large even by the standards of the Mississippi River's historically variable flood record. The American bottom, the city's agricultural heartland, may have been extensively damaged by this flood, and the agricultural disruption it caused may have triggered a population exodus and political crisis that began the city's decline. Agriculture-based urban settlements are particularly vulnerable to major flood events, because floods can destroy stored food, damage fields, and kill draft animals, leaving a large urban population dependent on a food production system that has been severely impaired. Climate change in the broader sense was also affecting the Mississippi Valley during this period. The medieval warm period, a phase of elevated global temperatures that peaked roughly between 900 and 1200 CE, was followed by the onset of the Little Ice Age, a cooler and more variable climatic period that began around 1300 CE and continued until the 19th century. The transition between these climate phases, which coincides roughly with the period of Cahokia's decline, brought increased drought variability to the central United States, with longer and more severe droughts interspersed with wet periods, producing the kind of agricultural unpredictability that is particularly difficult for large sedentary populations to manage. But the environmental factors alone do not fully explain the collapse, because similar environmental stresses affected other complex societies in other periods without producing the same degree of organizational failure. The question of why Cahokia's political system did not adapt to the environmental stress Why it did not find ways to manage the agricultural disruption and maintain the social organization that had built and sustained the city points toward internal political factors that may have been as important as the external environmental ones. Evidence of violence within the Cahokia period archaeological record, including what appears to be the massacre and mass burial of several hundred individuals at a site called Crenshaw in the Arkansas region, suggests that the political landscape of the Mississippian world was not uniformly stable or pacific during the city's period of dominance. Cahokia's power appears to have rested at least partly on the control of trade routes and the ability to extract tribute from subordinate communities, and both of these forms of power are inherently unstable, subject to challenge and disruption as competing centers develop their own power bases and begin to resist domination by the central city. The dispersal of Cahokia's population after the city's decline was not a simple disappearance. The people who had lived in the American bottom did not vanish. They moved, mostly northward and eastward, to the river valleys of what are now Wisconsin and Illinois and Iowa, where new centers of Mississippian culture developed in the period after Cahokia's decline. The specific social and ceremonial traditions of Cahokia were dispersed and transformed rather than simply lost, and their traces appear in the archaeological record of the communities that formed in the wake of the city's abandonment. This pattern of dispersal followed by reconstitution in new locations is characteristic of the entire history of Mississippi Valley civilization. The collapse of Hopewell around 400 CE was followed by the Late Woodland period, which appears from the outside as a simpler and less impressive cultural phase, but which was in fact a period of dispersal and reconfiguration, during which the people of the Hopewell interaction sphere reorganized themselves into different social configurations in different parts of their former range. Out of that reconfiguration came the foundations of Mississippian, 500 years later, representing a different organizational form for the same fundamental tradition of cosmological engagement with the landscape. The pattern suggests that collapse in the Mississippi Valley was not the end of a story, but a transition within a continuing story, a reorganization of the same basic cultural tradition into new forms better suited to new conditions. The deep continuity of the tradition, its persistence across 5,000 years and multiple episodes of apparent collapse and regeneration, argues against seeing any of its individual phases as the whole story, or its end as the conclusion of something that once existed and will never exist again. What ended, definitively and catastrophically, was not the tradition itself, but the specific instantiation of it that existed at the time of European contact. The epidemics that swept through the Mississippi Valley in the 16th century did not simply reduce population. They disrupted the transmission of knowledge. They killed the specialists who maintained the astronomical traditions, the ritual specialists who performed the ceremonies, the political leaders who organized the agricultural and architectural systems. They disrupted the social institutions within which the tradition was embedded and through which it was transmitted. They created a discontinuity in the chain of cultural transmission that the subsequent colonial period made permanent. Through the deliberate suppression of indigenous cultural practices and the forced conversion and assimilation programs that characterized the relationship between colonial governments and Native American communities for 3 centuries, the tradition did not disappear entirely. Indigenous communities in the Southeast and the Mississippi Valley have maintained elements of the knowledge systems and cosmological frameworks that the archaeological record documents, adapting them to changed circumstances in the ways that living traditions always adapt without abandoning their essential character. The green corn ceremony, practiced by Creek and Cherokee and other southeastern nations, preserves elements of the ceremonial relationship to the agricultural calendar that is documented in the Mississippian archaeological record. The cosmological frameworks of many Siouan-speaking peoples of the Great Plains, whose ancestors included the populations that dispersed from the Cahokia region after its decline, maintain elements of the skywatching tradition that the woodhenge represents. The knowledge is not entirely gone, but it is fragmented and reduced from what it must have been when the city was functioning at its peak. This fragmentation is itself part of what makes the hidden history of the Mississippi so poignant, so significant, and so difficult to fully recover. The archaeological record gives us the physical form of what was built and used and exchanged. The surviving indigenous traditions give us fragments of the meaning that animated those physical forms. But the full integration of form and meaning, the complete reconstruction of what it was like to live in Cahokia at its height, to participate in the ceremonies, to understand the cosmological significance of the solar alignment as the equinox sun rose over the top of Monk's Mound. This is something that may never be fully recoverable because the transmission chain was broken in ways that no subsequent scholarship, however careful and however respectful, can entirely repair. What we can do is take seriously what the evidence suggests and be honest about what we do not know. We can treat the builders of the Mississippi Valley earthworks as the sophisticated and knowledgeable people they clearly were, rather than diminishing their achievements through the lens of assumptions about what pre-Columbian North Americans were capable of. We can invest in the investigation of what remains to be found, in the ground, in the river, in the surviving knowledge of descendant communities. We can tell the story of what we know with the specificity and the depth that the evidence supports, rather than reducing it to simple bullet points in a textbook chapter on prehistoric North America. And we can hold open the genuine mysteries, the questions that the evidence raises but does not answer, with intellectual honesty and genuine curiosity, rather than filling the gaps with speculation that exceeds what the data supports. There are specific mysteries in the Mississippi Valley record that deserve to be named as mysteries, things that the current state of knowledge cannot explain, and that may require evidence that does not yet exist to resolve. The first is what I will call the problem of the gap. Between the Archaic period, when Watson Brake was built, and the Woodland period, when Hopewell flourished, there is a gap of roughly 1,500 years, during which the tradition of monumental earthwork construction appears to have been substantially reduced in scale, if not entirely absent. The archaic cultures of the Mississippi Valley built Watson Brake and a handful of other large earthwork complexes. The early woodland cultures that followed built mounds that are generally smaller and less elaborate. Hopewell represents a sudden scaling up of earthwork construction that has no obvious immediate precursor. Where did the Hopewell tradition come from? What was the cultural and social context within which the extraordinary efflorescence of the Hopewell interaction sphere developed? The standard answers involve the intensification of long-distance exchange as a driver of social complexity, the development of new agricultural technologies that allowed larger populations, the emergence of new religious ideologies that motivated large-scale ceremonial construction. These answers are not wrong, but they are incomplete, and the specific content of the cosmological and ritual tradition that the Hopewell earthworks encode, the astronomical knowledge, the specific geometric forms, the cosmological significance of the artifacts deposited in the burial mounds points toward a level of cultural sophistication that did not develop overnight. Something was there before Hopewell. Something in the archaic and early woodland periods was building the intellectual and institutional foundation for what Hopewell became, and that something is not yet fully visible in the archaeological record. The gap is not a gap in the human population of the region. People were there throughout the period between Watson Brake and Hopewell. The gap is in the visibility of the traditions they were developing, and that gap may reflect a genuine period of reduced scale and complexity, or it may reflect the limitations of the archaeological record in capturing the full range of what was happening, particularly in the areas of organic material culture, architectural forms that have not survived, and intellectual traditions that did not leave direct physical traces. The second mystery is the problem of what I will call parallel development. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the Hopewell earthworks, particularly the lunar standstill alignments at Newark, requires exactly the same scale of observational effort as the knowledge encoded in monuments in other parts of the world that are often cited as evidence of ancient astronomical sophistication, specifically the megalithic monuments of Western Europe, some of which are also aligned to the lunar standstills. The relationship between the North American and European traditions of lunar standstill alignment, if any, is an open question. They could be entirely independent developments, separated by an ocean and by thousands of years of separate cultural evolution. Or they could reflect some deeper connection, some transmission of astronomical knowledge, or some shared intellectual tradition whose common roots lie further back in time than either tradition's earliest known expression. No evidence of direct communication between the Hopewell tradition and the megalithic traditions of Western Europe has been found, and the hypothesis of such communication is not supported by the mainstream archaeological literature. But the parallel is striking enough to deserve acknowledgement as an open question rather than a settled one, and the possibility that it reflects some shared underlying tradition of astronomical thinking, perhaps going back to populations that were continuous before the separation of the Americas from Eurasia, is at least worth holding open as a conceptual possibility, even if it currently lacks supporting evidence. The third mystery is the strangest and in some ways the most difficult to discuss without straying into territory that exceeds what the evidence supports. It concerns the question of what exactly the Hopewell and Mississippian peoples were doing with the astronomical knowledge they encoded in their earthworks. The case for the Woodhenge at Cahokia being used as a practical agricultural calendar is relatively easy to make. Knowing the precise dates of the solstices and equinoxes is practically useful for agricultural timing, and the Woodhenge would have allowed Cahokia's specialists to determine those dates with precision and to organize the agricultural cycle around them. The case for the lunar standstill alignments at Newark being used as a practical lunar calendar is also relatively easy to make. Knowing where you are in the 18-year lunar cycle has implications for the timing of certain types of fishing, for the prediction of optimal planting times in connection with lunar phases, and for other practical activities. But there is a third possible use for precision astronomical knowledge that is neither purely practical nor purely ceremonial, and that is the use of astronomy as a navigational tool. People who can determine the precise direction of sunrise on specific days of the solar year, and who can track the position of the moon against the horizon throughout its 18-year cycle, are people who have the intellectual tools to navigate by the sky. Not ocean navigation, for which other skills and tools are required, but land navigation across the interior of a continent, determining one's position and direction by reference to celestial positions in a way that allows systematic travel across terrain without landmarks. Whether the Hopewell or Mississippian peoples used their astronomical knowledge for navigation in this sense is not something that the current archaeological evidence allows us to confirm or deny, but the trade networks that those cultures maintained, the movement of goods and people across distances of hundreds of miles through terrain that was covered by forest without the kind of visible landmarks that facilitate navigation in open country, required some systematic means of maintaining direction and position. The sky, for people who understood it with the precision that the Newark earthworks imply, would have been a natural navigational instrument, and it is worth wondering whether the astronomical traditions of the Mississippi Valley were applied not just to the orientation of major buildings, but to the practical problem of moving through the landscape on the scale that the trade networks required. This brings us to a thought that is perhaps the most fundamental and the most humbling that the hidden history of the Mississippi raises. The people of pre-Columbian North America were solving the same problems that every other civilization in human history has had to solve. How to organize large numbers of people in cooperative activities, how to produce and distribute food reliably, how to maintain knowledge across generations, how to understand the natural world well enough to predict its behavior and adapt to its variability. They were solving these problems in the specific context of the North American continent, with the specific resources and constraints that that continent provided, and they were solving them with intelligence and ingenuity and sustained effort over timescales that dwarf any individual human life. The solutions they developed were not the same as the solutions developed by civilizations in other parts of the world. They did not develop writing in the same form, though some researchers believe that certain marking systems found in the Mississippi Valley represent early forms of symbolic notation that are not yet fully understood. They did not develop metallurgy in the same sense, though they were working native copper with great sophistication for thousands of years. They did not build in stone in the way that Mediterranean and Mesoamerican civilizations did, though the Hopewell earthworks and the Cahokia complex are as impressive by any reasonable measure as many stone-built monuments elsewhere in the world. Their solutions were adapted to their context, earth rather than stone, because the river valleys of the interior of the continent provided earth in abundance and stone in limited quantities. Organic materials for structures rather than permanence, because the ecological and climatic conditions of the region made permanent stone structures less practical. Social organization that prioritized networks and exchange relationships over territorial states, because the geography of the continent, with its great river highways, facilitated network organization in ways that rewarded connectivity rather than isolation. These were not failures to achieve what civilizations elsewhere achieved. They were different achievements, adapted to a different context, and they deserve to be understood and appreciated on their own terms rather than evaluated by the standards of civilizations that developed in different contexts. The tendency to compare pre-Columbian North American achievements to those of Egypt or Greece or Rome, finding them deficient by comparison, reflects a failure of imagination and a misunderstanding of what civilizations actually are and what they are for. Civilizations are human solutions to human problems in specific environmental and historical contexts. The solutions of the Mississippi Valley civilization, different as they were from the solutions developed elsewhere, were adequate to the problems they were addressing for thousands of years. That is a remarkable record of success, and the investigation of that success, the recovery of what it actually consisted of, is one of the most exciting frontiers of contemporary scholarship. Each new discovery in the Mississippi Valley and the adjacent river systems adds to our understanding of what pre-Columbian North America was. Each new analysis of the astronomical alignments or the trade networks or the agricultural systems or the cosmological frameworks deepens our appreciation of the sophistication of what was accomplished there, and each new find from the ground or the riverbed raises new questions that push the investigation further. The river is not done with its secrets. The ground is not done yielding them. The investigation of the hidden history of the Mississippi is ongoing, and its most exciting discoveries may still lie ahead, in the unexcavated portions of known sites, in the unsurveyed areas of the floodplain, in the waterlogged deposits of the river channels and the continental shelf, and in the surviving knowledge of the descendant communities who have maintained the connection to this tradition through all the disruptions of the past 500 years. What the river knows, it holds. What the ground holds, it will eventually yield. The question is only whether we are paying attention when it does. Now, there is something that happens when you follow a story like this one, a story that keeps deepening the further you go into it, that keeps revealing layers beneath layers, complexity beneath apparent simplicity, sophistication beneath the surface that the standard narrative provides. Something happens to the way you see the landscape. The river you cross on your commute becomes something else. The flat farm fields of the Mississippi Valley, stretching to the horizon in every direction, become something else. The low, irregular shapes in the terrain, the ones that might be natural hillocks or might be the weathered remnants of earthworks that nobody has investigated, become something else. The entire physical landscape of the central United States becomes, if you let yourself see it this way, a palimpsest, a document written and rewritten over 10,000 years, with the most recent writing on top and the oldest writing deepest, and all of it significant, all of it part of a story that has not yet been fully told. The people who wrote that story were not mysterious or alien. They were human beings, with the same fundamental needs and capacities and curiosities that all human beings have, applied to the specific challenge of living well in the specific place that the Mississippi Valley offered. They observed the sky with care and patience because the sky told them things they needed to know. They built earthworks on a massive scale because the earthworks served purposes, cosmological and practical and political, that their societies required. They maintained trade networks across enormous distances because those networks connected them to the materials and the relationships and the information that their communities needed to thrive. They developed bodies of knowledge about the natural world, the plants and animals and soils and weather of the Mississippi Valley that were refined over thousands of years into something that modern ecologists are only now beginning to appreciate and partially recover. They were extraordinary people doing extraordinary things, in ordinary time, in one of the most productive and beautiful river systems in the world, for 10,000 years. And the river is still there. The ground is still there. The sky they watched, the same sky that the Woodhenge was built to measure, is still there, rotating above the American bottom in exactly the way it always has, the sun still rising behind Monk's Mound at the equinoxes, in exactly the alignment the Cahokians encoded in their solar calendar 1,000 years ago. The river still moves, the earth still holds what it has been given, and the story continues to emerge, slowly, from the silence of the ground, for anyone who is paying the right kind of attention. The Mississippi knows things. It has been knowing them for a very long time. We are only beginning to learn how to ask it the right questions. Think about what it means to stand on the bluffs above the river on a clear night, far enough from city lights to see the full sweep of the stars, and to know what you now know about what happened in the valley below you. To know that people stood in approximately this spot 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 4,000 years ago, and looked up at the same stars with the same fundamental human need to understand their place in the universe, and that they encoded what they understood in the landscape in ways that are still decipherable today. To know that the elaborate traditions of astronomical observation and earthwork construction that those people developed were not primitive gropings toward knowledge but sophisticated achievements in themselves. Expressions of intelligence applied with sustained attention to the most fundamental questions about the human relationship to time and space and the cosmos. To know, in other words, that the history of the place you are standing is both much longer and much more interesting than the one that was written in the history books you were given in school. That the story of North America, of this river, of this valley, does not begin in 1492 or 1607 or 1620, but in the melting of the glaciers, in the first steps of the first people through the passes of the ancestral ranges, in the accumulation of knowledge across thousands of years of careful attention to the world, that the people who were here before the Europeans arrived were not simply inhabiting a wilderness, but were living in a landscape that they had been actively shaping and managing and understanding for longer than the entirety of recorded European history. This is the hidden history of the Mississippi. Not a secret in the sense of something deliberately concealed, though aspects of it were deliberately suppressed or ignored. A secret in the sense of something that requires the right kind of attention to see, that reveals itself slowly and partially to those who look carefully, that rewards sustained curiosity with increasing depth and complexity and wonder. A secret that the river keeps not out of malice, but out of the simple fact that the most important things tend to be the deepest, and the deepest things take time to recover. The river runs south through the heart of the continent, carrying the sediment of the plains and the water of 10,000 smaller streams, gathering everything and holding nothing for long, always moving toward the Gulf, always building the delta, always carrying forward the accumulated substance of the watershed in the inexorable downstream current. Beneath it, in the riverbed, in the cut banks, in the deeper layers of the floodplain, the story continues to wait. Above it, in the night sky that the mound builders read with such care and precision, the stars continue their slow rotation. The equinox still comes twice a year, on exactly the days when the Woodhenge's alignment becomes visible, when the sun rises directly over Monk's Mound, as seen from the observation post in the Great Cedar Circle. The lunar standstills still mark their 18-year cycle, the moon still reaching its extreme northern and southern positions and appearing to pause before reversing, exactly as the Newark octagon records, in its precise geometric form. Everything the mound builders knew is still true. The sky they mapped is still above us. The river they navigated is still running. The earth they transformed is still beneath our feet. What we have lost is not the things themselves, but the knowledge of how to read them, the tradition of attention that made these physical facts meaningful, the cosmological framework within which the sun rising over Monk's Mound at the equinox was not just a geographic coincidence, but a confirmation of the cosmic order, a reminder that the human world and the cosmic world were aligned, that the ceremonies performed in the plaza below the mound were working, that the universe was in order, that things were as they should be. We are in the process of recovering that knowledge, partially and imperfectly, and with respect for the communities whose heritage it is, and whose right to be consulted about its investigation is recognized in law and in the growing ethical consciousness of the archaeological profession. The recovery is slow, the gaps are enormous, the losses are irreplaceable, but the investigation continues, and each year brings new discoveries, new analyses, new understandings that fill in parts of the picture that were previously blank or mistaken. The hidden history of the Mississippi is not fully hidden. It is not completely lost. It is being found, piece by piece, site by site, artifact by artifact, alignment by alignment, and it is turning out to be richer and stranger and more impressive than anyone was quite willing to believe when the investigation began. It is turning out to be exactly what the landscape always suggested it was, if you were paying the right kind of attention. The record of an extraordinary human achievement, sustained across thousands of years, in one of the world's great river systems, by people whose intelligence and sophistication and deep knowledge of their world deserve our recognition, our respect, and our sustained curiosity. The river runs on. The ground holds what it holds. And somewhere beneath the surface of the familiar American landscape, in the mud and silt and clay that the Mississippi has been laying down since the glaciers retreated, the story continues to wait for us. Patient, as rivers are patient. Full, as rivers are full. Moving, always, in the direction that rivers move, which is southward and downward and toward the sea, carrying everything with it, losing nothing entirely, arriving eventually at the broad and quiet delta where the river ends and the gulf begins, where the land sinks into the water and the story becomes the sea, and the sea holds what the river gave it, and the light plays on its surface in the morning, in the way that light has always played on the water above the drowned world. What lies beneath the Mississippi is what lies beneath all rivers that have been running long enough through land that was inhabited long enough by people who were paying close enough attention. It is history. It is deep and layered and mostly invisible and endlessly significant. And it is there. It has always been there. Close your eyes for a moment and try to feel it. The river running through the dark, the stars turning overhead, the ground holding its patience underneath. The long, long story of this place, going back further than any name we have been given for it, going back to the first step onto the floodplain, the first fire on the bank, the first careful look at where the sun rose and where it set, and what it meant that it rose there and set there and came back again each morning. This is what the Mississippi is hiding. This is what the ground knows. And someday, with the right tools and the right attention and the right questions, we will know it too. For now, let the river run. Let the stars turn. Let the ground hold what it holds. And let the story continue to emerge, as it always has, one discovery at a time, from the deep patience of the earth beneath the river, beneath the sky that the mound builders mapped so carefully and encoded so precisely in the landscape that even now, 1,000 years after they were built, their structures still point to the place where the sun rises on the longest day of the year, still point to the place where the moon pauses at its extreme, still hold in their geometry the record of a people's deepest understanding of the universe they inhabited. The Mississippi knows things. Someday, we will know them too, and that day is closer than it has ever been. Rest in that thought for a moment. The river running, the stars overhead, the ground beneath. the long, quiet story of a place that has been waiting patiently for us to finally look at it clearly and see what has always been there, hidden in the landscape, encoded in the earthworks, preserved in the careful geometry of the sky watchers who once stood where you are standing now and looked up at the same stars with the same fundamental human question. What does it all mean? They built the answer in the earth, and the earth is still holding it, and the river is still running past it, and the sky is still there, and the answer is still waiting. There are things about the Mississippi Valley's hidden history that we have not yet fully addressed, things that sit at the edges of what the conventional archaeological literature is willing to say, but that the evidence keeps pointing toward, questions that serious researchers have raised, and that have not been resolved and may not be resolvable with the tools and the evidence currently available. These are the genuinely open questions, the places where the story has not yet been written, and they deserve attention precisely because they are unresolved, because unresolved questions are where understanding grows. The first of these open questions concerns the nature of Cahokia's political authority and the geographical extent of its influence. In the standard presentation, Cahokia is described as a chiefdom, a society organized around a hereditary elite that commands labor and tribute from a surrounding population without achieving the full institutional complexity of a state. This classification is somewhat circular, because the definition of chiefdom is partly built around the assumption that complex societies without certain specific features, notably writing and a monetized economy, cannot be states. But Cahokia had features that stretch the chiefdom category in ways that some researchers find uncomfortable. Consider the evidence for what has been called a Cahokian diaspora. In the century or so following Cahokia's peak, Mississippian sites with material culture closely resembling Cahokia's appear at considerable distances from the American bottom in places like the Black Warrior Valley in Alabama, the Middle Cumberland River in Tennessee, and the upper Nodaway region of Missouri and Iowa. These are not simply communities that traded with Cahokia or borrowed its iconographic tradition. They appear to represent actual colonization, the establishment of new communities by people who came from Cahokia or from communities under Cahokia's direct political influence, carrying with them the specific material culture and presumably the social organization of the place they came from. Colonization implies the ability to organize and direct the movement of significant numbers of people over long distances to establish new communities in territories that were already inhabited by other people. This requires a level of political authority and the institutional capacity to exercise it that goes beyond what the conventional chiefdom model attributes to Mississippian societies. It implies something more like empire, or at least like the kind of expansionist polity that organizes colonization as a political strategy. Whether Cahokia was a proto-state or a particularly powerful chiefdom, or something that fits neither category comfortably, is a question that researchers have been debating for decades, and that the current evidence does not fully resolve. What it does suggest is that the organizational complexity of Cahokia at its peak was greater than the standard presentations acknowledge, and that the political geography of the Mississippian world in the 11th and 12th centuries was shaped by Cahokia's influence in ways that extended far beyond the American bottom. This, in turn, raises questions about how that influence was exercised, how Cahokia maintained its authority over distant communities and managed the relationships between those communities and the center, what the mechanisms of political communication and coordination were in a world without writing or telecommunications, and what ultimately happened when those mechanisms failed or were disrupted. These are questions about political economy and institutional history that the archaeological record can address only partially, because the physical evidence of political institutions, the documents and correspondence and administrative records that historians studying literate civilizations rely on, does not exist in this context. What the archaeology gives us instead are the physical traces of political activity, the construction and maintenance of large public works, the distribution of prestige goods, the evidence of tribute flow in the form of agricultural and craft surpluses, the organization of storage and distribution, and the patterns of violence and conflict that mark political boundaries and political competition. These traces are informative, but they leave significant gaps in our understanding of how the political system actually worked. The second open question concerns the role of specific ecological knowledge in the long-term persistence of the Mississippi Valley tradition. The people of the Watson Brake period, 5,400 years ago, were living in an environment that was in some ways different from, and in some ways similar to the environment of Cahokia's Peak, 1,000 years ago. Over the intervening 4,000 years, the climate changed, the river system changed, the ecology of the valley changed in response to both natural factors and human management. The human communities that inhabited the valley across this period were not passive observers of environmental change. They were active managers of their landscape, using fire and selective harvesting, and in some periods active planting to shape the vegetation and productivity of the land around them. The ecological knowledge required to manage a complex river valley environment effectively over thousands of years is not simple or easily acquired. It requires understanding the behavior of the river system, the patterns of flood and drought, the seasonal cycles of plant and animal productivity, the long-term dynamics of soil fertility and forest succession and water table variation. It requires the ability to recognize and respond to change, to distinguish normal variation from problematic trend, to know when and how to intervene, and when to let natural processes work without interference. And it requires the transmission of that knowledge across generations, the maintenance of a body of ecological understanding that accumulates observations from the experience of many lifetimes and transmits them in usable form to subsequent generations. The specific form in which this ecological knowledge was transmitted in pre-Columbian Mississippi Valley cultures is not fully known. The oral traditions that would have been the primary vehicle for transmission have been disrupted and partially lost. But there are enough surviving elements in the ecological knowledge of descendant communities and in the ethnobotanical and ethnozoological records compiled by early anthropologists to suggest the outlines of a very sophisticated ecological knowledge system, one that recognized the relationships between different elements of the landscape in ways that modern ecology is still working to fully document and understand. Some of the ecological management practices of Mississippi Valley peoples have been particularly well studied and have produced insights with significant implications for contemporary land management. The tradition of controlled burning, for example, practiced by indigenous peoples across the eastern United States, including the Mississippi Valley, was for a long time dismissed by Euro-American land managers as primitive and destructive. It is now recognized as a highly sophisticated practice that maintained the biological diversity of eastern North American landscapes for thousands of years and that, when properly practiced, produces ecologically healthier and more productive landscapes than the fire suppression policies that replaced it in the 20th century. The biodiversity of the eastern North American landscape that Europeans encountered when they arrived was not a natural given. It was the product of thousands of years of deliberate management by the people who inhabited it, management that shaped the distribution and abundance of plant and animal species in ways that supported human use while maintaining ecological integrity. Understanding this does not diminish the beauty or significance of the landscape. It enhances it by revealing it as a collaboration between human intelligence and natural process extending across deep time, a collaboration that produced results that the most sophisticated modern ecological management is still struggling to achieve. The third open question, and perhaps the most unsettling one for the conventional narrative, concerns the population of pre-Columbian North America and the implications of that population for how we understand the evidence of what we find when we look at the landscape. The population of the Americas at the time of European contact has been one of the most contested questions in historical demography for over a century. Early estimates, made by scholars who were influenced by the assumption that pre-Columbian North America was sparsely populated, put the total population of the hemisphere at a few million at most. Later estimates, as the evidence for epidemic mortality became better understood, and scholars worked backward from the population levels of the early historic period to estimate what the pre-epidemic populations must have been, produced much higher numbers, with some researchers arguing for a population in the tens of millions for the hemisphere as a whole. For the Mississippi Valley specifically, the implications of higher pre-contact population estimates are significant. A densely populated valley, inhabited by communities of the size and organizational complexity that Cahokia and its contemporaries represent, produces a fundamentally different kind of landscape than a sparsely populated one. It produces a landscape that has been extensively modified by human activity over a long period of time, a landscape in which the apparent natural features are in many cases the product of human management rather than purely natural process. It produces a landscape in which the distribution of plant and animal species reflects the cumulative effect of thousands of years of human presence, selection, management, and use. When European settlers arrived in the Mississippi Valley, after the epidemic mortality of the 16th and 17th centuries had reduced the indigenous population to a fraction of its previous level, what they found was a landscape that had been recovering from the removal of its human managers for several generations. The forests that had returned to formerly cultivated areas were not the same forests that had existed before human management, because the seed stock and the soil conditions and the competitive dynamics of the vegetation had all been shaped by the preceding millennia of human influence. The animal populations that had reorganized themselves after the abandonment of managed landscapes were not the same as they would have been in the absence of human management. The rivers were not running in the same courses they had run during the period of intensive human management of the watershed. In other words, the wilderness that the settlers saw and described and ultimately claimed as justification for displacement of the indigenous population was not a natural wilderness at all. It was a managed landscape in a state of management withdrawal, a cultivated garden temporarily left to its own devices, beginning to revert toward something more natural but still carrying the marks of thousands of years of human presence. The wilderness narrative was not a description of what was actually there. It was a misreading of the landscape, produced by the combination of genuine ignorance of what had preceded the epidemic mortality and motivated reasoning about the nature of indigenous peoples' relationship to the land. This matters for the hidden history of the Mississippi because it changes the interpretive context for every piece of evidence that archaeologists find in the valley. A sherd of pottery found in a field in Missouri is not a fragment from a primitive culture practicing subsistence agriculture in a sparse landscape. It is a fragment from a culture that was managing that field and the surrounding region as part of a complex agricultural and ecological system, a culture that was connected to other cultures across hundreds of miles of managed landscape, a culture that had been refining its management practices for thousands of years and had produced a landscape of extraordinary productivity and diversity as the result of that refinement. Understanding this changes what questions we ask when we look at the evidence. Instead of asking, how did these people survive in this challenging landscape, we ask, how did these people create this productive landscape, and what can we learn from the way they did it? Instead of asking, what explains the apparent simplicity of their material culture, we ask, what was the full range of their knowledge and practice, and what portion of it has survived in the archaeological record? Instead of asking, why do these people's achievements seem to fall short of what civilizations elsewhere accomplished, we ask, what were the specific achievements of the Mississippi Valley tradition on its own terms, and how do they compare to what was accomplished in other contexts facing similar challenges? These are better questions, and they produce better answers, and the answers they produce are more interesting and more significant than the answers to the old questions, because they reveal a tradition that was genuinely remarkable rather than merely exceeding lowered expectations. There is one more thing to be said about the hidden history of the Mississippi, something that brings us back to the beginning of the story, to the question of what the river knows and how we might come to know it too. It is something that the specialists who work in this field know, though they do not always say it in these terms, and it is something that the physical experience of being at these sites at Cahokia and Poverty Point, and Newark and Serpent Mound, tends to produce even in people who have no prior knowledge of the archaeology. These places have a quality of presence that is difficult to describe in purely analytical terms. When you stand at the summit of Monk's Mound and look out over the American bottom, or when you walk the oval ridge of Watson Brake in the late afternoon light with the shadows lengthening across the central space, or when you find yourself inside the Great Circle at Newark trying to feel the scale of it from the inside, something happens that is not fully captured by descriptions of engineering feats and trade networks and astronomical alignments. Something in the quality of the place itself communicates that it was significant, that the people who built it and used it were fully present there in a way that left something behind in the ground and the air, some residue of intensity of attention. This is not mysticism. It is observation. The places where sustained human attention has been focused for many generations have a quality that is detectable by subsequent visitors, not through supernatural means but through the physical reality that intentional landscape transformation leaves persistent marks, and that those marks communicate intentionality to anyone who is sensitive enough to attend to them. The great earthworks of the Mississippi Valley communicate the intentionality that created them across 1,000 years and 10,000 years and more, because the intentionality was so profound and so sustained that it is written into the physical form of the earth itself. The river runs through this landscape still. The American bottom stretches south and west from the base of Monk's Mound, in the same way it has stretched for 10,000 years. The sun rises over the eastern bluffs and sets over the western ones, in the same relationship to the mound's orientation that the Cahokians encoded when they chose this place and designed this site. The Mississippi gathers the water of 1,000,000 streams and carries it south toward the Gulf, the same water that the people of the American bottom drew from and fished in and traveled on for the entire span of their remarkable tradition. What is hidden beneath it all, in the ground and the river and the submerged shelf of the Gulf Coast, is not gone. It is waiting. It is patient, as rivers are patient, as the earth is patient, as the stars are patient in their slow rotation above the valley, where the greatest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico once stood in its full complexity and beauty and meaning. We are learning to ask the right questions. We are developing the tools to recover what the ground is holding. We are building the understanding that will eventually let us read the full text of what the mound builders encoded in the earth. The river knows things, and we are beginning, slowly and with the profound humility that 10,000 years of buried history demands, to learn how to listen. There is something deeply moving about what this investigation reveals, not just as an academic exercise but as a human one. To follow the evidence of pre-Columbian civilization in the Mississippi Valley is to encounter people across a gap of centuries and millennia, and to recognize them as fully human, as people who were grappling with the same fundamental questions that human beings have always grappled with. How do we organize ourselves? How do we feed ourselves? Reliably. How do we understand our place in the cosmos? How do we maintain the knowledge that our community needs across the disruptions of time and change and catastrophe? How do we make something beautiful, something that expresses our understanding of the world and our place in it, something that endures? The Cahokians answered these questions in the form of a city organized around a solar calendar, its central mound aligned with the equinoxes, its plaza engineered to a precise level grade, its neighborhoods housing craftspeople and administrators and farmers, and the specialists who maintained the astronomical and ritual traditions. The Hopewell people answered them in the form of trade networks spanning a continent and earthwork geometries encoding the cycles of the moon. The Poverty Point people answered them in the form of semicircular ridges aligned with the summer solstice sunrise and a trade network that connected the Ozarks to the Appalachians to the Gulf. The Watson Brake people answered them in the form of an oval earthwork complex 5,400 years ago that we are still trying to fully understand. Each of these answers is impressive on its own. Together, they constitute a tradition of sustained intellectual and practical achievement that should occupy a central place in how Americans understand the history of the continent they live on. but that has been largely invisible in the standard presentations of that history. The uncovering of that tradition is one of the important intellectual projects of our time. It is happening in the field as archaeologists excavate new sites and apply new technologies to known ones. It is happening in the archive as researchers read early accounts with fresh eyes and recover descriptions of things that were once dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. It is happening in the laboratory as scientists analyze ancient materials with techniques that reveal their origins and composition in ways that were not possible a generation ago. And it is happening in the community as descendant communities reclaim the history of their ancestors and insist on the recognition of the sophistication and significance of what those ancestors built and knew. The Mississippi River runs through all of it, literal and figurative, the constant that ties the story together, the oldest presence in the landscape, the keeper of the sedimentary record that holds the physical evidence of everything that has happened in the valley for the past 10,000 years. The river does not care whether we understand its history. It simply continues to run, carrying the sediment of the plains toward the sea, building the delta, holding what the watershed gives it, moving inexorably in the direction that water moves. But we care, and the caring, sustained and patient and open to what the evidence reveals, is what will eventually bring the hidden history of the Mississippi into the light, where it can be seen clearly, appreciated fully, and understood in the depth it deserves. The river knows things, the ground knows things, and we are beginning to know them too, one discovery at a time, one question at a time, one careful analysis at a time, building the understanding that the depth and complexity of this history demands. What lies beneath the Mississippi is not a mystery to be solved once and then set aside. It is a story to be told, slowly and carefully and with respect for its depth, over many evenings and many tellings and many questions and many partial answers, each one adding to the picture, none of them complete, all of them necessary. The story continues, and the river runs on. Let us linger a little longer in this story, because there are threads that deserve to be pulled further, and because the deepest histories are the ones that reward the slowest kind of attention. There is a quality to the best of these investigations that is almost meditative, a quality of sitting with uncertainty and letting it teach you something, rather than rushing to close it off with a comfortable answer. The hidden history of the Mississippi invites this kind of attention, because the more carefully you look at it, the more it opens up, the more layers you find beneath the ones you thought you understood, the more questions arise where you thought you had found answers. We have talked about Cahokia and Poverty Point and the Hopewell earthworks and Watson Break. We have talked about the submerged shelf of the Gulf Coast and the trade networks that connected the Mississippi Valley to the rest of the continent. We have talked about the astronomical knowledge encoded in the earthworks and the cosmological framework that gave that knowledge meaning. But there are specific things, specific places, specific discoveries in the Mississippi Valley record that we have not yet touched on, things that deserve their own careful attention because they add dimensions to the story that the sites and traditions we have already discussed do not fully capture. Consider the shell mounds of the Tennessee River Valley. The Tennessee River, which is one of the major tributaries of the Ohio, which is in turn one of the major tributaries of the Mississippi, flows through a landscape that was intensively inhabited for thousands of years by a succession of indigenous cultures, each leaving its own layer in the archaeological record of the valley. Among the most striking and most imperfectly understood of these records are the great shell mounds that dot the Tennessee River Valley and extend into the adjacent limestone karst country of northern Alabama and Tennessee. These mounds, which are made primarily of freshwater mussel shells, accumulated over thousands of years at specific locations along the river. They are not uniform in their structure or their content. Some of them are essentially middens, accumulations of domestic refuse that simply grew larger over many centuries of occupation at the same spot, but others are clearly more complex, showing evidence of structured activity, deliberate construction, and in some cases, elaborate burials that indicate the mounds were serving ceremonial functions in addition to or instead of purely domestic ones. The largest of the Tennessee Valley shell mounds are enormous, covering several acres and rising to heights of several meters, comparable in scale to some of the earthen platform mounds of the Mississippian tradition. The people who created the Tennessee Valley shell mounds were hunter-gatherers in the traditional sense, living primarily on the resources of the river and the surrounding forest and limestone country. But they were hunter-gatherers who were repeatedly returning to the same specific locations over thousands of years, who were maintaining the same sites across many generations, who were investing significant collective effort in the elaboration of those sites beyond what simple domestic use would require. They were, in other words, doing in the Tennessee Valley something similar to what the Watson Brake people were doing in the lower Mississippi Valley at roughly the same time, maintaining a place-based tradition of communal activity and landscape modification that belies the simple picture of nomadic, unsettled hunter-gatherers. The shell mounds of the Tennessee Valley have been studied since the early 20th century, but they have been chronically underfunded and underinvestigated relative to their significance. Many of the major mound sites were partially or completely excavated in the 1920s and 1930s by expeditions from universities and museums that were primarily interested in the skeletal remains and burial goods they contained, and whose excavation standards were far below what is now considered necessary for the recovery of the full range of information that a site can yield. The skeletal remains from many of these early excavations are now the subject of repatriation negotiations with descendant communities under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and the sites themselves have been sufficiently disturbed that later investigators face the difficult problem of working around the damage done by earlier exploration while trying to extract what information remains. What the early excavations did establish, and what subsequent investigation has confirmed and extended, is that the Tennessee Valley shell mounds were places of considerable cultural significance that were used continuously or repeatedly over periods of several thousand years, and that the people who used them were engaged in practices that included not only subsistence activities, but also elaborate mortuary ritual that required significant social organization to sustain. The burials from these sites show evidence of social differentiation, of individuals who were treated differently in death than their contemporaries, whose bodies were accompanied by goods that represent the products of considerable craft skill, and in some cases, long-distance exchange. They show evidence of communities with defined social roles and hierarchies, communities that understood themselves as part of a tradition that extended across generations, that honored their dead in specific ways, because those ways were required by the cosmological framework within which their lives made sense. These communities were part of the same broader cultural world as the Watson Brake builders, and their shell mound tradition, which predates Watson Brake by several thousand years in some cases, may represent one of the origins of the complex social and ceremonial practices that the later mound-building traditions elaborate. The relationship between the shell mound traditions of the river valleys and the platform mound traditions of the Archaic and Woodland periods is one of the areas of Mississippi Valley archaeology where the picture is least clear and where carriers of these braze. The potential for significant discovery is greatest because the question of how complex ceremonial practice developed in the Mississippi drainage before the emergence of the traditions that are most visible in the archaeological record remains genuinely open. There is another specific thread in the hidden history of the Mississippi that deserves careful attention, a thread that connects the pre-Columbian record to the early historic period in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable to examine, because examining them requires sitting with the full weight of what the colonial encounter destroyed. This is the thread of the specific communities that De Soto's chroniclers described in the 1540s, communities that were present in the Mississippi Valley at a level of organizational complexity and population density that has not been adequately explained by the archaeological literature, and that were effectively gone by the time systematic European contact resumed. De Soto's chronicles, read carefully, describe a political landscape in the Mississippi Valley that is far more complex than anything the standard textbook presentations of pre-Columbian North America prepare you to expect. They describe paramount chiefs controlling territories that extended across many days' travel, with subordinate chiefs paying tribute and providing military service to the paramount authority. They describe towns of several thousand people, with organized political and ceremonial hierarchies, substantial architectural traditions, and food storage systems that maintained the population through the winter. They describe roads and bridges and signaling systems, and a logistics infrastructure that supported the movement of armies and the transfer of tribute across large distances. Some of what the Spanish described was exaggerated, certainly, and some of it reflects their own cultural categories imposed on what they were seeing rather than an accurate description of what was actually there. But the core of what they describe, the densely populated, politically organized, architecturally impressive landscape of the 16th century Mississippi Valley, is consistent with what we know from the archaeological record of the immediately preceding Mississippian period, and it represents a level of social complexity that the epidemic mortality of the following century effectively eliminated before systematic European scientific observation could document it. This is one of the great tragedies of American intellectual history, the fact that the traditions and knowledge systems and organizational forms of pre-contact North American civilization were not documented before they were destroyed, and that what we have instead is the partial and distorted record of early colonial encounters, interpreted through the lens of people who did not understand what they were looking at and were often not interested in understanding it on its own terms. The loss is not just academic. It is a loss of knowledge, of ways of understanding and managing the natural world, of social and political experiments that represented thousands of years of accumulated experience with the specific challenges of living in the North American continent, experiments that might have had much to offer to the people who came after if they had been recorded and understood rather than suppressed and destroyed. What we can recover from the ground is substantial, and it is increasing every year as new tools and new questions and new investments in the investigation of the Mississippi Valley's archaeological record produce new discoveries. But what we can recover from the ground is always an incomplete record, always a sample rather than the whole, always filtered through the specific conditions of archaeological preservation that favor some kinds of evidence over others. The full story of the pre-Columbian Mississippi Valley, the full complexity and sophistication of what was built and known and practiced there across 10,000 years, may never be fully recoverable. But the investigation will continue, the questions will continue, the discoveries will continue, and each discovery, however partial, however fragmentary, adds something to our understanding of what the Mississippi Valley was and what it contained, and what the people who lived there were doing with the remarkable intelligence and sustained attention that human beings bring to the challenge of making sense of the world. There is something in the slow unfolding of this history that mirrors something in the nature of the river itself, the way it moves, patient and inexorable, carrying everything with it, losing nothing entirely, building over time from the accumulated material of the entire watershed. The history of the Mississippi Valley, recovered piece by piece from the ground and the river and the archives and the surviving traditions, accumulates in the same way, each fragment adding to the whole gradually taking shape from the fragments, the shape never quite complete but always recognizable as the outline of something real and significant and worth understanding. The river has been running since the glaciers melted, 10,000 years of continuous southward flow through the heart of the continent. In that time, it has carried the residue of everything that happened in the watershed, everything the people of the valley built and used and discarded and buried, through the channels and into the delta and eventually into the Gulf, while simultaneously depositing new material on the floodplain, burying the old landscape under new sediment, covering the record of the past with the residue of the present, always building, always moving, always adding to the accumulated depth of the valley's geological and human history. We are standing on top of that depth. We live on the surface of a landscape that contains within it, if we could read it fully, the record of 10,000 years of human presence and human achievement and human knowledge. The reading is slow, the investigation is ongoing, the discoveries are still coming, and the river runs on, patient and steady and full of what the watershed has given it, heading south toward the Gulf, carrying the story forward. What lies beneath the Mississippi is not a mystery that will be solved completely. It is a mystery that will be approached more and more closely, understood more and more fully, appreciated more and more deeply, as the investigation continues and the evidence accumulates and the questions improve and the tools develop and the understanding grows. The river knows things we are still learning. The ground holds things we have not yet found. The sky above the valley is the same sky that the Woodhenge was built to measure, the same sky that the Newark octagon encoded in its earthen geometry, the same sky that the builders of Poverty Point aligned their concentric ridges toward at the summer solstice sunrise. All of it is still there. All of it is still waiting. All of it is still part of the ongoing story of the most important river in the North American continent, the story that begins before history and continues after the last page has been written. The Mississippi knows things, and as you drift now toward the edge of sleep, with the river running somewhere in the dark and the stars turning overhead and the ground beneath you holding the patient weight of everything that has ever happened here, the most honest and the most important thing we can say about the hidden history of the Mississippi is simply this. The story is not finished. It was never finished. It is being told right now, in the work of researchers who are carefully excavating the ground, in the traditions of communities whose ancestors built the mounds, in the slow accumulation of understanding that each new discovery adds to what came before, in the turning of the sky above the American bottom where the sun still rises at the equinox in alignment with the mound that the Cahokians built 1,000 years ago to mark exactly that moment. The sky turns. The river runs. The earth holds what it holds. And somewhere beneath all of it, in the quiet dark of deep time, the story of the people who first came to this valley and never stopped building it, never stopped watching the sky above it, never stopped knowing it in the way that only people who have lived somewhere for 10,000 years can know it. That story is still unfolding, still adding to itself, still finding its way toward the light of understanding through the patient thickness of the earth. Rest now. The river will keep running while you sleep. The stars will keep turning. The mounds will keep standing. And in the morning, or in a week, or in a year, or in a generation, someone will find something new in the ground of the Mississippi Valley. Something that adds another dimension to the story, another layer of understanding to what was there and what it meant and who the people were who built it. The investigation is ongoing. The story is not finished, and the river knows things we are still learning to hear. There is a quality to the light in the Mississippi Valley at certain times of year, specifically at the equinoxes, when the angle of the sun's approach to the horizon produces long, level rays that travel across the flat floodplain and illuminate the mounds from the side in a way that makes them suddenly visible in a way they are not at other times of day or in other seasons. The slanted light catches the subtle irregularities of the earthen surfaces, the small variations in grade and texture that mark where the original construction differed from the surrounding natural terrain, and in that light, the mounds become not just large shapes in the landscape, but detailed structures, complex artificial things with grain and texture, and the unmistakable look of something that was deliberately made. People who visit Cahokia at the equinox, who are there early enough in the morning to watch the sun come up over the eastern horizon and illuminate Monk's Mound from the side, report an experience that is difficult to articulate in purely analytical language. The mound at that light, at that time of year, looks alive in a way that it does not at noon or in the flat light of an overcast day. It looks intentional. It looks like what it is, which is the largest earthen structure in the pre-Columbian world, built to be exactly here, oriented to this precise astronomical relationship, maintained and elaborated over 3 centuries by people who understood why it was here and what it meant that the sun rose exactly where it rose on the equinox morning, in alignment with the mound's primary axis. The experience of being at a place like this, at the right time, with the knowledge of what it is and what it was, is one of those experiences that reorganizes something in a person's understanding, not just of North American history, but of human history more broadly, of what human beings are capable of when they bring sustained intelligence and sustained attention and sustained commitment to a project across many generations. These things were built. They were built by people. People built them here in this specific valley, in alignment with this specific sky, over the course of this specific tradition that extended in various forms for 5,000 years. And they are still here. And the sky they were built in relation to is still the same sky. And the understanding they encoded in their geometry is still waiting to be read by anyone willing to learn the language. The hidden history of the Mississippi is, in the end, a story about what human beings can do when they take the time and the care to do it right. When they observe carefully enough and long enough and with enough commitment to recording and transmitting what they observe. When they organize their communities in ways that allow coordinated effort to be sustained across generations. When they embed their understanding of the world in permanent physical form so that it outlasts any individual life or any individual generation and remains present in the landscape for the generations that come after. These things were done here, in this valley, by these people, for 5,000 years. The river knows things, and now, a little more than before, so do we. Sleep well. The Mississippi is still running. The stars are still turning. The mounds are still standing. And the story of what was built in this valley, and why it was built, and what it meant to the people who built it, is still being recovered, piece by patient piece, from the deep and eloquent silence of the ground. What the investigation of the Mississippi Valley ultimately teaches us, if we are willing to receive the lesson, is a kind of epistemic humility that cuts in two directions simultaneously. On one hand, it teaches us humility about how much we do not know, about how incomplete our picture of the pre-Columbian world in North America still is, about how many major sites remain unexcavated, how many questions remain unanswered, how much of the record has been lost to the river and to time and to the specific catastrophe of the epidemic mortality. On the other hand, it teaches us humility about the confident wrongness of our previous certainties, about how thoroughly the old narrative of North American prehistory as a story of simple, isolated, unsophisticated peoples missed the actual story, which was far more complex and far more impressive and far more interesting than the comfortable assumptions of an earlier era of scholarship allowed anyone to see. Both kinds of humility are productive. The first keeps us open to what new evidence will reveal, keeps us from assuming that what we know now is adequate to what the record will eventually show us. The second keeps us honest about the costs of wrong assumptions, about what happens when we let ideology or comfort or simple inattention prevent us from seeing what is in front of us clearly. The hidden history of the Mississippi is a lesson in both kinds of humility, and taking it seriously requires bringing both to the investigation of what the ground and the river and the sky still have to tell us. The river runs on, the ground holds what it holds, and the story, older than any name we have been given for it, continues to emerge from the patient depth of the earth, one careful discovery at a time, in the valley of the great river that knows things we are still learning how to hear. This is not a simple story. It was never a simple story. It is a story with the depth and the patience and the complexity of the river itself, running through the heart of a continent, carrying the weight of everything that has ever happened in its watershed, moving always in the direction that water moves, which is downward and southward and toward the sea. The Mississippi carries history the way rivers carry sediment, in suspension, invisibly, distributed through the current, settling when the water slows, building up over time into something that changes the shape of the land. The history of the valley is in the river, and the river is in the history, and both of them are in the ground beneath us, patient and deep, and full of what we have not yet found the right questions to recover. Go slowly with it. Let it settle. The mounds are still there. The sky is still turning. The answer is still waiting in the earth. Rest now. The river still runs.